There is a country at the bottom of the world that most people think they understand. Wide, open, ancient, sun-scorched, empty in ways that other continents simply are not. A place where the rock itself is older than most of life on Earth, where the soil holds fossils of creatures that have no living descendants, where the silence in the interior gets so complete that travelers have described it as the sound of geological time pressing down from above. Australia is sold to the world as a place without secrets. What you see is what you get. Red dirt, blue sky, reef and coast. Clean, simple, honest. That story has always been wrong. Not wrong in some minor, correctable way, not a matter of perspective or emphasis or the kind of historical revision that happens when new documents come to light. Wrong in a structural way. Wrong in the way that matters when you start pulling at the edges of the official account and the thread does not stop coming. Because beneath Australia, there is something that the people who study the ground professionally will not discuss at press conferences. Something that appears in survey notes and then disappears from the follow-up publications. Something that Indigenous communities across the continent have been describing in precise, consistent, and geographically specific terms for as long as anyone has recorded their testimony, and that mainstream archaeology has been carefully not asking them to elaborate on. There are passages beneath Australia, not one passage, not a single anomaly that could be filed away as a cast curiosity or a geological freak. A network, or what appears to be a network, of passages distributed across a landmass that is nearly 3 million square miles. Passages in the sandstone country of the west. Passages in the limestone karst of the south. Passages in the ancient basement rock of the interior that is so old it should not have passages at all, not naturally, not on any timeline that the standard model of Australian geology finds comfortable. Some of them are known, a few of them have been entered, almost none of them have been mapped fully. And the question of who made the ones that cannot be explained by water, by pressure, by soluble rock dissolving over time, that question gets very quiet very fast when you bring it to the right people in the right offices. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is not a story about aliens or lost Atlantis or any of the frameworks that get attached to anomalous archaeology when the people discussing it do not want to be taken seriously. This is a story about evidence, about survey records, about ground-penetrating radar results, about testimony from communities that have been walking this continent for 60,000 years, about the specific and reproducible experience of entering places underground that were not made by water and were not made by any geological process anyone has been able to name. It is a story about what happens when the ground tells you something and the institutions built to listen have a prior commitment to not hearing it. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The continent of Australia is, by most measures of geological age, the oldest stable landmass on the surface of the Earth. The Pilbara Craton in the northwest holds rock that is more than 3.5 billion years old. The Yilgarn Craton in the southwest is not far behind. The Musgrave province in the center contains basement rock that geologists classify as Proterozoic, meaning it formed between roughly 500 million and 2.5 billion years ago in an era so remote that the organisms alive at the time left no bodies we could recognize, only chemical traces in sediment. When geologists talk about what Australia is made of, they tend to describe it in terms of stability. The shields, the cratons, the ancient basement rock, these are not places where dramatic tectonic events happen. Australia sits in the middle of a plate, not near an edge. It does not have the mountain building, the volcanic activity, the seismic violence of the Pacific Rim. The land is old and has been largely still for a very long time. This is what makes certain findings in the Australian subsurface so difficult to account for. Karst systems are well understood. Water dissolves soluble rock, primarily limestone and dolomite, and over long periods creates caves, sinkholes, and underground passages. Australia has karst, the Nullarbor Plain, stretching across the southern edge of the continent for roughly 1,000 miles, sits atop one of the largest limestone karst systems on Earth. Its cave networks are famous among cavers and geologists alike. The Nullarbor caves have been explored, catalogued, studied. They fit the model. Water, limestone, time. The pattern makes sense. But there are passages in Australia that do not fit the model. In the sandstone country of the Kimberley region of Western Australia, survey teams working for mining companies in the 1990s began documenting what their reports described as anthropogenic modifications to natural fissures. The word anthropogenic means caused by human activity. In a geological survey, finding that word in a description of underground passages is not a minor observation. It is a finding that, if confirmed, means that humans were in those passages and doing something deliberate. The reports were filed. Some were referenced in passing in academic papers about regional geology. None of them became the subject of a major research program. None of them were followed up with the kind of sustained, well-funded investigation that would normally accompany the discovery of evidence of ancient human activity in a geologically significant region. They disappeared into the archive the way inconvenient things tend to disappear. Not suppressed, exactly, just not pursued. The Kimberley is an extraordinary part of Australia, in ways that go well beyond its geology. The rock art found there, at sites across thousands of square miles of sandstone plateau and gorge country, is among the oldest confirmed art anywhere on Earth. Figures known as guion, sometimes called Bradshaw paintings after the first European to describe them in writing, appear across the Kimberley landscape in a style that is distinct from the art that surrounds them, distinct from the art made by the communities who have lived in that country for generations, distinct in ways that are hard to categorize and harder to explain. The communities who live in the Kimberley today, the Ngarinyin, the Wunambal, the Gambera, do not claim the guion as their own work. They describe the figures as made by a people who came before, a people who had a different relationship with the landscape, who knew things about the country that the current custodians acknowledge they do not fully know. And among the things those people knew, according to testimony that has been collected by anthropologists and documented in research going back to the early 20th century, was the interior of the ground itself. The passage systems. This is not fringe speculation. The testimony exists. It is in archives. It has been cited by serious researchers in serious publications, usually in footnotes, usually framed as mythology or cosmology, rather than geographical information. The distinction matters. When a community describes underground passages in terms that sound cosmological, those descriptions tend to be filed under religion. When they describe them in terms that are geographically specific, with directions, distances, and physical details that could be verified by anyone willing to enter the ground and check, those descriptions get much quieter treatment. We will come back to this. The European settlement of Australia began formally in 1788, with the arrival of the first fleet at what would become Sydney. Within the first years of the colony's existence, settlers began encountering the underground country in ways that the official record preserves, sometimes clearly, sometimes in fragments that require careful reading to understand what the author was actually describing. The Blue Mountains west of Sydney were for years described as impassable by the colony's administrators. The Darug and Gundungurra people who had lived in that country had been crossing the mountains for thousands of years. They knew routes through the sandstone escarpments, through the canyon systems, through passages in the rock that the early settlers did not find because they were not being shown. The first detailed European description of underground space in the Australian interior comes not from an explorer but from a surveyor. Thomas Mitchell, who served as Surveyor General of New South Wales in the 1830s and 40s, left field journals that are preserved in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. Among his observations from an 1836 expedition into what is now western New South Wales, there is a passage that most summaries of his work do not include. He describes encountering, near what he called a remarkable escarpment, an opening in the rock that his party investigated briefly before withdrawing. The opening, he wrote, showed evidence of having been made regular. He used that word, made regular, as if something irregular in nature had been worked into a consistent shape. Mitchell was an experienced surveyor. He knew the difference between a natural crack in sandstone and a passage that had been worked. He noted it. He moved on. The follow-up that his observation warranted did not happen. This is a pattern that repeats across the historical record of the Australian interior. An observer with relevant expertise notices something anomalous. They record it, usually briefly, usually in the context of doing something else. The observation does not become the subject of investigation. It sits in an archive and waits. The question is not whether these observations exist. They do. The question is what it would mean to take them seriously, and what the history of not taking them seriously tells us about how decisions get made about which evidence counts. To understand why the passages beneath Australia have received so little attention, you need to understand something about the history of Australian archaeology as a discipline. Australian archaeology developed in a context in which the inhabitants of the continent at the time of European contact were assumed by the dominant academic frameworks of the late 19th and early 20th centuries to represent a static culture, a people who had arrived at some point in the distant past and had not changed significantly since. A people, by extension, who had not built things, had not modified their environment in ways that would leave major traces, had not produced the kind of archaeology that European-trained scholars recognized as archaeology. This framework was wrong. We know now that it was wrong in almost every particular. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia represent the longest continuous cultural tradition anywhere on Earth. 60,000 years of continuous presence on a single continent, 60,000 years of environmental management, of technology development, of cultural production, of building knowledge systems about every aspect of the country they lived in, including what was under it. The firestick farming that shaped the Australian landscape, the complex social technologies that managed resources across vast territories without writing, the astronomical traditions that embedded precise knowledge of celestial cycles into oral literature, the engineering of fish traps and eel channels that represent large-scale water management, all of this has been slowly, grudgingly incorporated into the mainstream understanding of Aboriginal Australia over the past several decades. But the underground knowledge has been slower to follow. There is a concept in many Aboriginal Australian traditions that translates imperfectly but persistently as the country having depth, not metaphorical depth, physical depth. The understanding that the land above is connected to spaces below in ways that are navigable, that have been navigated, that matter in the present, not just in the past. This concept appears in traditions across the continent, from Arnhem Land in the north to the Coorong in the south, from the Kimberley in the west to the mountain country of the east. It appears in different languages, in different narrative frameworks, in different ceremonial contexts. But the structural feature is consistent. The land goes down as well as across. Among the Anangu people of the Western Desert, the country around Uluru, the sandstone monolith that rises from the flat red interior like a geological cathedral, the accounts of underground connections have been documented by researchers, including the anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner, whose mid-20th century fieldwork remains one of the most rigorous documentary records of Central Australian traditional knowledge. Stanner was careful not to impose interpretations. He recorded what he was told, and among the things he was told were descriptions of passages in the rock beneath Uluru that connected to places he was given directions to reach. Directions that, when later checked against topographical maps, corresponded to actual features of the landscape. This is the part that tends to get elided when the subject comes up in academic contexts. The directions work. Not every time, not with the precision of a GPS coordinate, but with the kind of rough accuracy that you would expect from oral transmission of geographical information across many generations. The passages described are in places where there are passages. The connections described correspond, when checked, to what the ground actually does. This is not mythology. Or rather, it is mythology in the original sense of the word, before the word was reduced to mean something made up. It is knowledge carried in narrative form because narrative is how knowledge that needs to last a very long time gets preserved. The Nullarbor Plain is the most dramatic example of known Australian underground space. Stretching across the southern edge of the continent from Western Australia into South Australia, the Nullarbor is a flat limestone plateau about 200,000 square kilometers in area. Beneath it is a karst cave system of enormous extent. Some of the caves are among the largest in the southern hemisphere. Cocklebiddy Cave, one of the best known, contains an underground lake that has been explored by cave divers to a distance of more than 6 kilometers from the entrance, with the passage continuing beyond the limit of the dive. The full extent of the Nullarbor cave system is not known. Estimates put the total length of passages at figures that have been revised upward repeatedly as exploration has continued. The Nullarbor caves are natural karst. Water dissolved the limestone. The caves formed over millions of years. This is not disputed and is not controversial. What is more complicated is the evidence, gathered from multiple independent sources over several decades, that some of the passages in the Nullarbor system show features that do not fit the natural karst model. Not all the passages, not even most of them, but enough, and in enough different locations, to constitute a pattern that demands explanation. The specific features that do not fit include wall modifications that appear to be tool marks rather than water erosion, floor surfaces in certain chambers that show a regularity of texture inconsistent with natural deposition, and, in at least 3 locations that appear in the research literature, sections of passage wall that have been shaped into consistent cross-sections over distances of more than 20 meters. The first person to document these features in a form that entered the scientific record was not an archaeologist. He was a geologist named Dr. Alexander Chalmers, who was conducting a survey of the eastern Nullarbor cave system in 1973 as part of a South Australian geological survey project. Chalmers was mapping cave morphology, the shapes of the passages and chambers, when he encountered a section of passage that he described in his field notes as having walls that showed consistent angular modification over a length he estimated at 35 meters. His field notes were filed with the survey. A summary of the survey was published. The angular modification was not mentioned in the published summary. When researchers have subsequently asked why, the answers have varied between the passage being considered a minor anomaly not relevant to the survey's primary objectives, and the relevant section of the field notes being, at various times, misfiled, difficult to locate, or simply not included in the material made available to researchers who asked. Chalmers himself died in 1989. He left no published account of what he found. What he left was a set of field notes, some of which are in the public archive, and some of which, according to researchers who have tried to access the complete set, cannot currently be located. This is where the story of Australian underground archaeology becomes something other than a straightforward history of scientific inquiry. It becomes a story about the relationship between evidence and institutions, about the way that findings that do not fit the established model tend to be handled not by refutation but by quiet administrative attrition. The findings do not get disproved. They do not even get contested, usually. They get misfiled. They get listed as minor anomalies. They get summarized in ways that leave out the part that matters. And then the researchers who try to follow them find the trail has gone cold through a series of steps that each seem individually unremarkable and together constitute something that functions like suppression without anyone having had to. Make a decision to suppress. We are going to trace that trail in some detail, because the detail is where the argument lives. In 1981, a small team of speleologists, that is, cave researchers, from the South Australian Speleological Society entered a section of the Nullarbor cave system that had not been surveyed since a brief visit by an amateur caving group in the 1960s. They were looking for new passages to add to the Society's mapping project. What they found, in the fourth chamber of a cave system they were among the first Europeans to visit, was a section of wall that one of the team, a man named Peter Hartigan, described in the Society's internal bulletin as showing cuts that went against the grain of the rock. Limestone caves have a natural grain. The rock is layered. Erosion follows the layers. When you cut against the grain in a consistent direction, you are doing something deliberate. You are imposing a direction on the rock rather than following what the rock gives you. Hartigan's description in the bulletin is precise enough to be taken seriously. He was an experienced caver. He knew what natural cave walls looked like. He was describing something he had not seen before in any natural cave. The Society's bulletin had a small circulation. The description did not attract attention outside a small community of cavers who read the bulletin, and within that community, it attracted the kind of interest that a strange finding generates when there is no obvious institutional mechanism for following it up. People noted it. People expressed interest. Nothing was done. This is partly because speleological societies, even serious ones, do not have the resources to conduct archaeological investigations. They are not archaeologists. They are cavers. They find things, they describe them, they move on to the next cave. The finding lands in the bulletin, and the bulletin goes on the shelf, and the next issue of the bulletin is about a different cave. Hartigan himself appears to have made at least one attempt to bring his observation to the attention of an archaeologist. There is a letter in his papers, which his family deposited with the South Australian State Archives after his death in 2003, addressed to the Archaeology Department of the University of Adelaide. The letter describes what he found, gives the location of the cave and the specific chamber, and asks whether anyone would be interested in taking a look. The response he received, which is also in the archive, acknowledges his letter and informs him that the department's current research focus does not include cave archaeology of this type. He is thanked for his interest in Australian archaeology and advised that he might contact the Australian Archaeological Association. There is no subsequent correspondence in his papers suggesting that he contacted the association or received a response from them if he did. We do not want to overstate what Hartigan found. We cannot independently verify his description because the cave has not been revisited for this purpose. We do not have photographs. We have a description from a credible observer in a form that was preserved by chance rather than by institutional design. This is the nature of much of the evidence in this area. It is real evidence. It is limited evidence. And its limitations are partly the product of the same institutional indifference that prevented it from being followed up. The pattern repeats. Someone goes underground. They find something that does not fit the model. They describe it. The description reaches an institution. The institution finds a reason not to pursue it. The description sits somewhere quiet and waits. But there is another line of evidence that runs parallel to the underground observations, and this line has more documentation and more institutional presence. It is the testimony of the people who have known the country for 60,000 years. The concept of underground passages, or more precisely underground routes, underground connections between places, is present across the full geographic range of Aboriginal Australian traditions. It is not confined to one region, one language group, or one ceremonial context. It appears in the dreaming narratives of the desert peoples, in the water mythology of the coastal peoples, in the creation stories of communities whose territories are separated by thousands of kilometers and who have had no historically documented contact with each other. When a concept appears independently across multiple cultures separated by distance and cultural boundaries, two explanations are possible. Either the concept emerged independently in each place because it describes something real about the shared environment, or the concept is part of a shared inheritance from a deeper common tradition that predates the cultural divergence of the groups in question. In Australia, the second explanation is not only possible but likely, given that we are dealing with a cultural tradition that has 60,000 years of history and that the communities in question are all descended from the founding population that entered the continent in that distant period. Either way, what the independent occurrence of the concept tells you is that it is not a local myth invented to explain a local feature. It is knowledge of something that the tradition treats as a feature of Australia as a whole, not this cave or that passage, but the underground country, as a thing that exists, that has always existed, that matters. The Ngarrindjeri people of the Lower Murray and Coorong region of South Australia have a tradition that describes the underground river system of the region in terms that are remarkably consistent with what hydrology later confirmed about the actual aquifer structure of the area. The Ngarrindjeri accounts, recorded by the ethnographer Norman Tyndale in fieldwork conducted from the 1920s through the 1950s, describe water moving underground in specific directions between specific named places. When the aquifer of the region was mapped by geological surveys in the latter half of the 20th century, the directions and connections described in the Ngarrindjeri accounts corresponded with sufficient consistency to the actual hydrogeology to suggest that those accounts were not cosmological invention but encoded geographical knowledge. Tyndale noted this correspondence in his research papers. He was careful about it. He framed it as suggestive rather than conclusive, but he noted it. And he drew the obvious implication, which is that the Ngarrindjeri knowledge of their underground country was not metaphorical. It was technical. This is a fundamental shift in how you think about indigenous traditions when it comes to landscape knowledge. The tendency in academic discourse has been to treat them as the spiritual layer over a physical reality described by science. The spiritual layer is interesting. It is important, culturally. It deserves respect. But it is not the same thing as physical description of the actual ground. What the Ngarrindjeri case, and many others like it, suggests is that this distinction is wrong. The spiritual and the geographical are not two separate layers. They are the same knowledge encoded in different formats. The dreaming narrative that describes an ancestor moving through a particular path underground is preserving, among other things, the information that there is a path underground in that location. You can get the physical information out of it if you know how to read it. The problem is that most of the people who have been employed to read it have not known how, because they were trained in disciplines that assume the physical description and the spiritual framework are separate things. Archaeology tells you about physical objects and spaces. Anthropology tells you about cultural frameworks. The knowledge that sits at the intersection, the physical, geographical knowledge embedded in cultural frameworks, falls between the disciplines in a way that has historically meant it falls through. In the 1990s, a researcher at the Australian National University named Dr. Margaret Meehan began what she described as a preliminary study of the correspondence between topographic features named in dreaming narratives and actual geological features in the same regions. The study was preliminary because it was funded only preliminarily. It produced results that she described in an internal report as striking enough to warrant a full research program. The full research program was not funded. The internal report exists. Researchers who have asked to see it have been informed that it is in the university's archive, but that its availability is subject to protocols related to its sensitivity as it contains material provided by Indigenous communities. Under conditions of cultural sensitivity, this is a legitimate consideration. Indigenous cultural materials are not automatically available to any researcher who asks. Communities have rights over their own knowledge, and have often had those rights violated by researchers who took what was shared in trust and published it without permission or in forms that caused harm. But the result, in this case, is that a piece of research that documented correspondence between Indigenous topographical knowledge and physical geological reality is not available to be built on, referenced, or verified. It sits in a drawer, functionally inaccessible, neither confirmed nor refuted, doing no work in the conversation about what is under Australia. This is the texture of the problem. None of the individual obstacles to investigation are obviously malicious. Each one is explicable by reference to ordinary institutional behavior, funding constraints, jurisdictional questions, cultural sensitivity protocols, and the general tendency of research programs to follow established lines of inquiry rather than anomalies at the edge. But the cumulative effect is that the evidence that points towards something significant beneath the Australian landscape has been, for a period of decades, effectively unable to accumulate into a case strong enough to compel a response. It accumulates anyway, more slowly than it should, in more fragmentary form than it should, but it accumulates. The geological anomaly that perhaps best illustrates the scale of what might be down there is not in the Nullarbor or the Kimberley or the Western Desert. It is in the Flinders Ranges of South Australia, a mountain chain that runs roughly 500 kilometers north-south through the state, and that contains, in its geological record, some of the most important evidence in the world for the evolution of complex animal life. The Ediacaran period, named for the Ediacara Hills in the northern Flinders Ranges, is the geological era immediately preceding the Cambrian explosion of complex animal life. The fossils found in the Flinders Ranges from this period, soft-bodied organisms that lived between 560 and 540 million years ago, have transformed understanding of how complex life began. They are genuine scientific treasures. The Flinders Ranges were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, in part because of their Ediacaran fossil record. What receives less attention is the observation, made by multiple geological survey teams working in the ranges over several decades, that the ranges contain a series of anomalous void spaces that do not correspond to any known speleological process. The rock of the Flinders Ranges is not primarily limestone. It is quartzite and shale and metamorphic rock. It should not have caves. And yet survey instruments have repeatedly detected voids in the subsurface of the ranges at depths and in locations that have no straightforward geological explanation. The first formal documentation of these anomalies appears to come from a 1967 survey conducted jointly by the South Australian Geological Survey and a team from the University of Adelaide. The survey was primarily concerned with mineral prospecting, specifically looking for copper deposits of the kind that had been found at nearby Kapunda and Burra in the previous century. The instruments used were geophysical instruments designed to detect density variations in the rock. They found copper traces in quantities too small to be economically interesting. They also found voids. The survey report, which is in the State Records of South Australia, devotes 2 paragraphs to the void anomalies. It notes their existence, describes them as unexpected given the regional geology, suggests they may be of karst origin in portions of the survey area that contain dolomitic rock, and recommends further investigation. The further investigation did not happen, at least not in any form that entered the public record. Since that survey, at least 4 other geophysical surveys have been conducted in overlapping areas of the Flinders Ranges. 2 of them, conducted in the 1980s and in 2001 respectively, included results that, when cross-referenced with the 1967 survey, show consistent anomalies in the same locations. The voids are not moving, because voids do not move, but they are appearing repeatedly in the same survey data, which means they are real. The 2001 survey, conducted by a private mining company whose reports are in principle public under South Australian mining disclosure rules, is perhaps the most detailed. Its geophysical data shows subsurface anomalies at 12 distinct locations within a survey area covering roughly 800 square kilometers. At 7 of those locations, the anomalies show characteristics that the survey's lead geophysicist, in a technical appendix to the main report, described as difficult to reconcile with known natural geological processes in this rock type. That phrase, difficult to reconcile with known natural geological processes, is the language a careful scientist uses when they want to be accurate about what their data shows without making a claim they cannot yet support. It is a flag. It is a flag that says something is here and we do not understand it. It is the kind of flag that should attract attention and resources and investigation. The technical appendix in which that phrase appears was not included in the summary of the survey's findings that the mining company provided to the state government as part of its disclosure obligation. It was in the full report, available to researchers who knew to ask for the full report, but it was not in the summary. This keeps happening. The detail is in the full document, the summary leaves it out, and most of the people who encounter this area of inquiry encounter the summary. We have now been circling the core question without stating it directly. It is time to state it directly. The passages and voids beneath Australia, the ones documented in field notes and survey reports and caving bulletins and Indigenous testimony and geophysical anomaly data, if they are not the product of natural geological processes, if they are, as the evidence that exists suggests they might be, the product of deliberate construction or modification, then who built them? This is the question that makes the institutions nervous, because the answer, if the evidence is what it appears to be, is not that the passages were built by some unknown ancient civilization from outside Australia. That is the easy answer, the one that gets attached to anomalous archaeological findings in places where the Indigenous history is poorly understood or has been suppressed. The answer, if you follow the evidence where it goes, is more confronting than that. The answer is that the passages may have been made by the ancestors of the people who are still living in Australia, by the communities whose traditions describe the passages in terms that correspond to their actual locations and physical characteristics, by a human tradition of underground modification that is 60,000 years old, and that has been almost entirely absent from the mainstream account of Australian prehistory, because that account was constructed by people who did not believe that the people living in Australia when they arrived were capable of the kind of work those passages represent. This is not the first time that the evidence for Indigenous Australian technological sophistication has been ahead of the institutional willingness to recognise it. The complex aquaculture of the Bujbim cultural landscape in Western Victoria, where the Gunditjmara people built an extensive system of channels and stone weirs to manage eel populations across a large area of the landscape, was a significant undertaking of hydraulic engineering. For most of the period of European-Australian history, the people who built that system were described as simple hunter-gatherers who had no agriculture and no permanent structures. The system they built has been dated to more than 6,000 years ago. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The adjustment of the mainstream account took almost 200 years from first contact to heritage listing. If it took 200 years to acknowledge what was visible on the surface, in stone, in a landscape that Europeans were farming within a few decades of settlement, the timeline for acknowledging what is underground is likely to be longer. But the underground evidence is starting to accumulate in forms that are harder to ignore. In 2014, a team of researchers from the University of Western Australia, working in collaboration with Martu traditional owners in the Western Desert, conducted a survey of a series of rock shelters and cave systems in the Gibson Desert, using a combination of archaeological and geophysical methods. The project was primarily focused on rock art documentation, but the geophysical component, ground-penetrating radar, and electrical resistivity tomography produced subsurface imaging that the project's geophysicist described in her published report as showing features inconsistent with natural formation. This is now in the published literature. It is a peer-reviewed paper. The features are described. The geophysical data is presented. The conclusion the authors draw is cautious but clear. They state that the subsurface features they identified warrant further investigation and that their characteristics are most consistent with anthropogenic modification of existing geological structures. Most consistent with anthropogenic modification in a peer-reviewed paper about caves in the Australian desert. This did not become a major news story. It did not prompt a government-funded research program. It appeared in a journal that is read by specialists and then filed alongside the other evidence that is waiting for the moment when the cumulative weight of it becomes impossible to dismiss. We are watching the approach of that moment. The Flinders Ranges anomalies bring us to a specific case that deserves extended attention. Not because it is the most dramatic or the most definitively documented, but because it illustrates with particular clarity the way that evidence accumulates in this area and the way that accumulation gets interrupted. In the township of Blinman, in the northern Flinders Ranges, there is a copper mine that was opened in 1862 and operated intermittently until 1970. The mine is now a tourist attraction. You can take a guided tour of the upper levels of the mine workings. You can see the 19th century hand drilling equipment, the stone walls of the original shaft, the kind of preserved industrial archaeology that tells a human story about the people who worked there. What the guided tour does not include, because the sections in question are now closed off by concrete and declared unsafe for public entry, is the lower level of the mine where, in the course of deepening the shaft in 1931, the miners broke through into a void. Voids in mines are not unusual. Mines in limestone country routinely break into natural cave systems. The Geological Survey notes for the Blinman mine from the 1930s, which are in the state records of South Australia and which have been examined by at least 2 researchers who have written about this, describe the void as follows. It was found to extend beyond the range of the lighting available to the exploration party. Its floor was described as smooth and level, in a way inconsistent with natural cave formation. The party advanced approximately 40 meters before turning back. A recommendation was made to conduct further exploration with improved lighting before continuing operations in the relevant section of the shaft. The further exploration was recommended in 1931. The mine continued operating off and on until 1970. The state records contain no documentation of the further exploration having been conducted. In 1970, when the mine finally closed, the lower shaft was sealed. The void, and whatever extent it has beyond the 40 meters that the 1931 exploration party reached, is now behind concrete. 2 researchers have tried to get permission to enter the mine and examine the sealed sections. Both were denied. The property is now managed by the Blinman community as a heritage tourism site, and the sealed lower levels are described in the relevant safety documentation as structurally unsafe for entry. This is plausible. Old mine workings are frequently genuinely unsafe. The sealed sections may genuinely be unsafe, and they may also contain a void whose floor is smooth and level in a way inconsistent with natural cave formation, as the 1931 survey described. Both things can be true simultaneously, and when both things are true simultaneously, the effect is that the question cannot be answered because access cannot be obtained because it is unsafe, which may be true and may also be conveniently true. We are not in a position to determine which, but we can note the pattern. The pattern is this. The finding is made, the finding is documented, the documentation is filed. The follow-up is recommended. The follow-up is not conducted. Access becomes restricted before the follow-up can happen. The finding sits in the archive, confirmed in 1 generation of documentation, and unable to be verified or refuted because access has been closed. This pattern is not unique to Blinman. It appears at multiple sites across South Australia, Western Australia, and the Northern Territory. The details vary. The underlying structure does not. There is another thread running through this story that we have not yet followed. It involves a specific geological formation in the Northern Territory that has been the subject of more sustained research attention than most of the other anomalies we have discussed, and that has produced findings that are, by the standards of the scientific literature that exists, remarkable. The Arnhem Land Plateau is a sandstone escarpment in the Northern Territory, covering roughly 80,000 square kilometers. It is one of the most significant archaeological regions in Australia, home to rock art that includes some of the oldest confirmed painted images in the world, and that represents a continuous cultural and artistic tradition spanning tens of thousands of years. The traditional owners of the plateau, the Yolngu and the Bininj Kunwok language groups, among others, have maintained their connection to the country in ways that make Arnhem Land one of the places in Australia where Indigenous knowledge has had the longest and most sustained opportunity to remain intact. The plateau is sandstone, not limestone. It should not have extensive cave systems, and yet the escarpment is honeycombed with caves, rock shelters, and passages that are among the most archaeologically significant spaces in Australia. The rock art inside these spaces has been dated through a variety of methods, including uranium, thorium, dating of calcite deposits overlying the paintings, to periods extending back more than 28,000 years. What receives less attention in the literature on Arnhem Land archaeology is a series of observations made by speleologists and geologists who have worked in the plateau over the past several decades about passages that extend beyond the rock shelter systems, below the shelters, into the deeper sandstone. Sandstone is not a soluble rock. It does not form karst. The natural processes that create extensive cave systems in limestone do not apply to sandstone in the same way. Yet, the geophysical surveys that have been conducted in sections of the Arnhem Land Plateau have repeatedly detected voids below the level of the known rock shelters. Voids that are not connected to the surface in any way that has been found. Voids whose existence, in the context of the regional geology, requires explanation. The explanation that has been offered most consistently by geologists working in the region is that the voids are the result of differential erosion. Sandstone is not uniform. Some sections are more resistant than others. Where soft layers have eroded away, voids form. This is a legitimate geological process. It happens in sandstone country. But the void geometries detected in the plateau surveys do not consistently match the geometry you would expect from differential erosion. Differential erosion produces irregular voids that follow the orientation of the softer rock layers. The voids detected in certain sections of the Arnhem Land Plateau surveys have profiles that, in the published geophysical data, appear to be more regular than differential erosion would predict. More consistently shaped, more consistently oriented. A geophysicist named Dr. Janet Fogarty, who was part of a research team that conducted a detailed subsurface survey of one section of the Arnhem Land Plateau in 2008, published her analysis of the void geometries in the Australian Journal of Earth Sciences in 2011. Her paper is careful and technical and does not make dramatic claims, but it contains a finding that, stated plainly, is remarkable. She found that at 2 of the 18 void anomalies detected in her survey area, the cross-sectional profile of the void matched, more closely than could be accounted for by natural geological processes, the profile of a deliberately excavated passage, meaning the shape of the empty space in the rock was more consistent with something having been cut out of the rock than with the rock having eroded away. She offered this as a finding, not a conclusion. She noted that the geophysical data alone was insufficient to determine cause, and that physical investigation of the void spaces would be required to resolve the question. She noted that such investigation would require collaboration with traditional owners and relevant permits. She expressed interest in conducting that investigation. The investigation has not been conducted, or has not been reported in the published literature if it has been conducted. Fogarty's paper exists. It is findable. It has been cited 9 times since publication. None of the 9 citations engage with the finding about void geometry. They cite her paper for its methodological contribution, its description of the geophysical survey technique, its data on the overall geological structure of the survey area. The specific finding about 2 anomalous void profiles is not engaged with in any of the 9 citations. This is a subtle but significant phenomenon. A finding is published, the finding is cited, but the specific finding, the part that does not fit the model, is not engaged with. The paper is treated as existing in the literature. The anomaly it contains is treated as not existing in the conversation. Science is supposed to work by accumulated engagement with findings. Findings that hold up under scrutiny become part of the established body of knowledge. Findings that do not hold up are refuted and discarded. But for a finding to be refuted, it has to be engaged with. If the response to a finding is to cite the paper for its methodology and ignore its conclusions, the finding has been neither confirmed nor refuted. It exists in a kind of scientific limbo, on the record but not in the conversation. Fogarty's finding about the Arnhem Land passage profiles is in that limbo. It has been on the record for more than a decade. It has not been followed up. It has not been refuted. It sits there waiting for the conversation to catch up with it. Now let us turn to a different kind of evidence. Not geophysical instruments, not survey records, not published academic papers. Let us turn to what people report when they go underground in Australia and find themselves in places that are not in the maps. Cave exploration in Australia has a relatively long history for a country whose population is largely concentrated on the coasts and whose interior has been systematically underexplored by European standards. The groups that have explored the most of the Australian underground are not government institutions or university research programs. They are volunteer caving clubs, whose members have been crawling through holes in the ground for the love of it since the early 20th century. These clubs maintain records. They publish bulletins, they hold annual conferences. And in the archives of Australian caving clubs, going back to the 1940s and 50s, when the clubs were established, there is a thread of observations that have never been gathered into a single account, and that, when you follow them, describe something that is either a pattern of systematic misidentification by experienced observers, or a pattern of findings that the mainstream has been declining to follow up on for 80 years. The observations are of a specific type. They are observations of walls, floors, and sometimes ceilings in cave passages that show what the observers describe as working. Evidence that a tool of some kind has been applied to the rock in a deliberate and consistent way. The observations come from caves in South Australia, Western Australia, and the Northern Territory. They come from observers with varying levels of experience, from first-time cavers excited about everything they see to people who have spent decades underground and know exactly what water erosion and physical pressure do to rock. The experienced observers are more cautious in how they describe what they see. They tend to use qualifications. Words like appears to show or seems inconsistent with, or as if worked. They are aware that they are making a claim that goes against the established model of what Australian caves contain, and they frame their observations accordingly. But the observations themselves are consistent. The same features appear in different caves in different parts of the continent, described by different people who have not read each other's accounts. Consistent cross-sections in passages that should be irregular, smooth sections of wall where the rock should be rougher, angular modifications in surfaces that erosion would have rounded, and, in several accounts, what the observers describe as wear patterns on floor surfaces. The kind of wear pattern that you get when a floor has been walked on by many people many times over a long period. One account that appears in a 1989 issue of the newsletter of the Western Australian Caving Association is particularly detailed. The author, identified only by initials in the newsletter's publication convention as DR, describes an exploratory trip into an unnamed cave system in the Kimberley. The author's description of the passage in question is as follows. The passage continued for what I estimate was 70 meters before the ceiling dropped to a level requiring crawling. Throughout this section, the walls showed a regularity of surface that I found myself unable to attribute to the limestone solution processes I would expect. The right wall in particular showed a consistent vertical face at a height of approximately 1.5 meters above the floor, as if cut. Below that line, the rock showed the irregular surface of solution weathering. Above it, a smoother and more consistent texture. I am reluctant to say what I think this means, because I am aware of how it sounds. But I note it because I found it notable, and because I think it should be in the record. In the record, it went. The newsletter archive is physical, in a binder in the association's store. The association's historians are aware of the account. No one has gone back to the cave to verify it, partly because the author did not give the cave's location with enough specificity to identify it, and partly because the culture of caving does not usually involve going back to look at something one member found unusual in a newsletter 3 decades ago. The physical archive is the problem. These accounts exist in physical form, in physical archives that are not digitized, not indexed in any way that would allow a researcher to search them systematically, and not accessible to anyone who does not know to look for them and has the time to go through them physically. The information has been recorded. It is in the record. It is, for most practical purposes, invisible. This invisibility is not an accident in any conspiratorial sense. It is the natural consequence of the way that the record of amateur exploration has been kept, and the way that institutions have related to that record. Caving club archives are not the archives of scientific institutions. They are not expected to contain findings that matter to the mainstream. They are expected to contain records of who went where and what they found in a practical exploration sense. The informal, cautious, reluctant observations that something looked worked, that a wall looked cut, that a floor looked worn, these do not fit the implicit category of what gets followed up on even within the caving community, let alone outside it. The result is a distributed record of unusual observations that is real, that is documented, and that functions as effectively as an undiscovered record because the mechanisms for gathering it into a coherent form and subjecting it to systematic examination have not been created. This is changing. And the change is coming, as it often does, from technology. Ground-penetrating radar has been used in Australian archaeology for several decades, primarily for mapping known archaeological sites, identifying buried features, and conducting non-invasive surveys of places where physical excavation is not possible or not permitted. The technology has improved dramatically over the period of its use. Earlier systems produced coarse images. Current systems can detect and resolve features at depths of several meters with a spatial resolution of a few centimeters. In 2016, a research team from Flinders University conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of a site in the northern Flinders Ranges that had been flagged in previous archaeological surveys as potentially significant. The site was on Adnyamathanha country, and the survey was conducted in collaboration with the Adnyamathanha traditional owners who had requested the investigation. The survey produced subsurface imaging of a void system below the survey area. The void system had, in the words of the published report, a spatial organization that the survey team found difficult to account for through reference to known geological processes. The voids showed spatial regularity at a scale that the authors described as suggestive of planning. Suggestive of planning. That phrase is in a published academic report. It is not in a Caving Club newsletter. It is not in a field note that was never published. It is in a peer-reviewed publication from a respected Australian university describing a ground-penetrating radar survey conducted in collaboration with traditional owners who requested the investigation. The Adnyamathanha traditional owners requested the investigation because their traditions describe underground passages in the area. They wanted to know if the passages their traditions described were physically present. The survey said yes, there is something there, and it looks planned. The follow-up to this finding has been the subject of ongoing negotiation between the research team and the Adnyamathanha community about the terms under which further investigation would be conducted, what data would be shared and in what forms, and who would have control over the findings. These negotiations are appropriate. They reflect a genuine and important set of rights that the Adnyamathanha have over the investigation of their country. They also mean that the physical investigation of the void system has not yet happened in a form that has entered the published literature. What has entered the published literature is the geophysical result. The void system is there. It looks planned. That is on the record. The question of what to do with what is on the record is, right now, an open question in Australian archaeology. There is a growing body of researchers who are treating the accumulated evidence of subsurface anomalies as something that deserves systematic investigation rather than individual case-by-case dismissal. There are institutions that are beginning to fund work in this direction, usually framed under the broader heading of Indigenous landscape archaeology or country-based knowledge, which allows the research to proceed without having to make upfront claims about what will be found. This is pragmatic. It allows the work to be done. It also means that the most significant finding that might emerge from the work, that the passages are deliberate constructions rather than natural formations, will need to be argued for against a prior commitment of institutional caution. But the work is happening. Let us now go to a part of Australia that has produced the most consistently documented body of underground anomaly evidence. Not the Flinders Ranges, not the Nullarbor, not the Arnhem Land Plateau, though all of those are important. The most consistently documented evidence comes from a region that most people in Australia know primarily for its scenery. The Blue Mountains of New South Wales are visited by millions of tourists every year. They are a sandstone plateau that rises abruptly about 50 kilometres west of Sydney, cut through by deep river gorges, covered with eucalyptus forest, populated with cascading waterfalls and dramatic cliff faces. They are extraordinarily beautiful. They are also, if the accumulated record is to be trusted, more interesting underground than they have been given credit for. The sandstone of the Blue Mountains is not the kind of rock that forms extensive cave systems through natural karst processes. It is not limestone. Yet the mountains contain hundreds of cave systems, ranging from small rock shelters to passages of several hundred meters that have been explored by cavers and that are registered with the New South Wales government. The registered caves are natural. They are the product of joint processes: water erosion along fracture zones, mechanical weathering of the sandstone, collapse of rock masses creating shelter spaces. These processes produce irregular, unpredictable, difficult to navigate passages. They do not produce consistent passage profiles. They do not produce smooth floors. They do not produce what the documented observations in some Blue Mountains caves describe. The Gros Valley, in the northern part of the Blue Mountains, has produced more documented observations of anomalous underground features than any other single area in New South Wales. The valley is steep-sided and difficult to access, which has limited the extent of exploration and means that significant portions of the valley's cave systems have never been formally surveyed. The observations that have been made come from bushwalkers and cavers who have entered the valley on their own initiative. In 2012, a bushwalker named James Leary documented on a bushwalking forum a trip he had made into the Gros Valley that took him into a cave system he had not previously visited. He described the cave as having a section that he estimated at roughly 60 meters in length, in which the walls on both sides were smooth and consistent in a way he had not encountered in any other Blue Mountains cave. He described the floor as flat, not the irregular, rocky floor of a natural cave, but a flat surface that showed what he described as signs of having been smoothed. Leary was not a geologist or an archaeologist. He was a bushwalker who had been walking in the Blue Mountains for 20 years. He was not making a claim about ancient civilizations. He was describing what he saw and asking if anyone had a geological explanation for it. The forum discussion that followed was exactly what you would expect. Some people offered geological explanations. Some people asked where the cave was and expressed interest in visiting. Some people suggested he had misidentified natural features. Leary engaged with the responses thoughtfully and maintained that what he had described was accurate. The cave he described has not, to any available public record, been formally investigated by geologists or archaeologists. The forum thread exists in the archive of the forum. The description exists in the thread. And the cave, somewhere in the Gros Valley, has, whatever it has, undetermined. This is the texture of the evidence at the lower end of the documentation spectrum. Individual accounts, described by ordinary people who went somewhere and saw something, preserved in formats that may or may not survive, subject to exactly the kind of dismissal that individual accounts from unqualified sources tend to attract. But Leary's account is not isolated. There are, in the record of Blue Mountains exploration, at least a dozen similar accounts from the past 30 years. Some from bushwalkers, some from cavers, some from people who have no official relationship to the mountains at all, but who have entered caves, for the simple reason that people enter caves. A consistent thread of observations about passages that seem more regular than they should be, floors that seem smoother than they should be, walls that seem to have been worked rather than eroded. The Darug and Gundungurra peoples, whose country the Blue Mountains is, have traditions that describe underground passages in the mountains. These traditions have been partially documented by researchers, including the historian Keith Vincent Smith, who spent decades recording Darug oral histories, and who noted in his published work that the Darug knowledge of the underground country of the Blue Mountains was extensive and precise in ways that went beyond what he expected from cosmological narrative. Smith is careful in how he discusses this. He is a historian, not an archaeologist or a geologist. He notes what he was told. He does not draw conclusions about what it means physically, but he notes it, and it is in the published record of Darug oral history. The Gundungurra people, whose country overlaps with the southern Blue Mountains, have a tradition that describes a specific underground route through the mountains that was used in the past for travel between the coastal country to the east and the inland country to the west. The tradition gives specific landmarks above ground that correspond to points along the underground route. Researchers who have checked the landmarks described in the tradition against topographical maps have found that the landmarks exist and are in the locations the tradition places them. The underground route has not been located, but the tradition that describes it uses geographical information about the surface that is accurate, which means the tradition is transmitting real geographical knowledge, which means the underground route it describes is worth looking for. Nobody is looking, not actively, not with resources, not in a sustained way that would have any real chance of finding it. There are individual researchers who would like to look, There are traditional owners who would support looking. There is no funded research program doing the looking. The Jenolan Caves, the most visited cave system in Australia, lie at the edge of the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney. They are a limestone karst system whose main cave passages have been open to the public since 1866, making them one of the oldest continuously operated show caves in the world. They are genuinely extraordinary. The limestone formations, the massive cave chambers, the underground river, these are among the most spectacular natural features in New South Wales. What most visitors to the Jenolan Caves do not know is that the known cave system, the portion that is toured and mapped and documented, represents only a fraction of the total cave system that is believed to exist. The hydrology of the Jenolan area, the way that water enters and exits the limestone, strongly implies the existence of significant cave passages that have not been found from the surface. The water must be going somewhere. The caves that have been found are not sufficient to account for all of it. The search for additional Jenolan passages has been ongoing in a quiet way for decades. Cavers probe the edges of the known system. Dye tracing experiments follow the water to try to locate where it goes. The results have repeatedly suggested the existence of significant unexplored passages to the north and east of the currently known system. In 1994, a team of cave divers attempting to push further into the Jenolan underground river system reached a point at which the passage narrowed to a size they were unable to pass. Before turning back, one of the divers reported seeing, through the clear water, a passage continuing beyond the restriction that appeared, in his description in the New South Wales Cave Rescue Squad log, to widen significantly. He estimated the passage he could see, but not reach at several meters in diameter. A several meter diameter passage, if it exists, is a significant cave. The passage has not been verified because the restriction has not been passed. Attempts to bypass the restriction through adjacent passages have not succeeded. The passage, if it is there, is documented in one diver's observation and nothing else. The Jenolan Caves Management Authority has conducted periodic assessments of the feasibility of accessing the passage beyond the restriction. The assessments have concluded each time that the technical difficulty and risk of the attempt exceed what can currently be justified. This may be accurate. The caves are genuinely difficult. Diving in underground river systems is genuinely dangerous. And the potential significance of what might be beyond the restriction has not been weighed against those difficulties in any formal process that has entered the public record. There is one more thread in the Blue Mountains story that we should not leave out. In 2003, a researcher named Gary Opit, working in the southern Blue Mountains near Katoomba, documented a series of observations at a site he called, in his published account, the most geologically anomalous space he had encountered in 40 years of bushwalking in New South Wales. Opit was not a professional geologist. He was a naturalist, an experienced observer of the natural world who had spent decades in the bush. His published account, which appeared in a small local history publication and has been cited by several subsequent researchers who were looking for documentation of underground anomalies in the region, described a cave system he accessed through a narrow entrance in a sandstone cliff face. The cave system consisted, in his description, of 3 chambers connected by passages. The first chamber was unremarkable. The second chamber had walls that showed what he described as beveled edges at the junctions of wall and ceiling, a feature he had never seen in natural sandstone caves. The third chamber, which he reached through a narrow connecting passage, had a floor that he described as so flat and regular as to appear deliberately leveled. Opit took photographs. He included some of them in his published account. The photographs are not of sufficient resolution to resolve the specific features he describes, but they are consistent with his description of a cave system that is different from typical Blue Mountains sandstone shelters. He noted the site's location in his published account with enough specificity that it should in principle be findable by someone with the interest and the time. No one, to the publicly available record, has gone back to verify his observations. This is the pattern, consistent across 3 decades. Consistent across the geographic range of the Blue Mountains. Individual observers entering individual caves and finding individual things that do not fit the model. writing them down, sometimes in forums and newsletters and small publications, and the accumulated weight of those individual findings never being gathered and evaluated and followed up because the mechanism for doing that does not exist. The mechanism does not exist because the institutional assumption has been that there is nothing to find. The archaeology of the Blue Mountains is the archaeology of rock shelters, of surface sites where Aboriginal Australians lived, made art, conducted ceremony, not underground passage systems that might have been deliberately constructed or modified. That is not what the Blue Mountains contains, except that it might. And the communities whose country the Blue Mountains is have been saying something underground is there for as long as anyone has recorded their testimony. We need to talk about what the evidence, taken as a whole, actually suggests. The evidence does not prove that there is a network of deliberately constructed or modified underground passages beneath Australia. The evidence is too fragmentary, too distributed, too unevenly documented to support a claim of that strength. What the evidence does is establish a persistent pattern of anomalous underground observations across a continent. Observations that are consistent with each other in their description of features that do not fit natural geological processes, made by observers from a range of backgrounds and expertise levels, in contexts including formal scientific surveys, informal exploration, and the recorded traditional knowledge of communities with 60,000 years of continuous connection to the land. A persistent pattern of anomalous observations, distributed across a continent, consistent in character, corroborated by Indigenous testimony, partially supported by geophysical data that has entered the peer-reviewed literature. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, quite a lot. It is not proof. But it is the kind of evidence that, in other contexts, would generate serious scientific attention. Why it has not generated that attention in this context is a question with several answers, none of them satisfying on their own, all of them contributing to the situation. The first answer is institutional inertia. The framework for understanding Australian prehistory was established in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and has been modified only gradually since. The modification has been significant in some areas. The antiquity of human presence in Australia is now understood to be much greater than the early framework assumed. The complexity and sophistication of Aboriginal Australian culture has been increasingly recognised. The technology, the environmental management, the social organisation have all been substantially revised upward from the original assumptions. But the underground has not been part of this revision. The question of what is beneath Australia has not been included in the rethinking of what Australia was before European settlement. It has remained outside the frame, not because there is no evidence for it, but because the framework does not include it as a question worth asking. The second answer is access. The underground of Australia is genuinely difficult to access. Caves in the Australian interior are remote. The logistics of conducting formal archaeological or geophysical investigations in many of the relevant locations are significant. The cost is high. The permit requirements, particularly in areas that are Aboriginal land or that include sacred sites, are complex and time-consuming to navigate. These are real barriers. They are not invented to block investigation, but they function to make investigation slower and more expensive than the level of institutional interest has been able to support. The third answer is the cultural sensitivity problem, which is real and not simple. The underground knowledge of many Aboriginal Australian communities is not freely available for investigation. It is protected knowledge. It is knowledge that carries ceremony and lore and meaning that is not appropriately shared with anyone who asks. Researchers who have wanted to follow up on underground testimony have had to navigate the legitimate and appropriate protections that surround that knowledge. Sometimes the communities involved have been willing to collaborate on investigation. Sometimes they have not. Sometimes the terms of potential collaboration have not been found. This is not a barrier that can or should be removed, but it is a barrier. The fourth answer is the one that is hardest to discuss without sounding conspiratorial, but that is nonetheless real. Research programs cost money. Money comes from institutions. Institutions have prior commitments to established models. A research program that begins with the hypothesis that there are deliberately modified underground passages beneath Australia is a research program that challenges the established model of Australian prehistory in a fundamental way. Challenging established models is not how you get funded. Funding follows from work that is confirmatory of established models or that extends them at the margins. Work that would potentially overturn them is a much harder sell. This is not conspiracy. It is the ordinary behavior of institutional science. It favors confirmation over revolution. It favors programs that are likely to produce publishable results that fit the existing framework over programs that might produce results that do not. This is not malicious. It is the product of how science is organized and resourced. But the effect is that the questions that most need asking, the questions that would most change our understanding if answered, are often the questions that are least likely to receive the resources needed to answer them. Australia is not unique in this. The same dynamic applies to anomalous archaeological findings everywhere. But Australia has particular features that make the dynamic particularly effective here. The Indigenous tradition is the most relevant body of testimony about what is underground. That tradition has historically been treated as outside the scientific frame. Even as that treatment has been revised, the revision has been incomplete and slow. The geophysical evidence is in academic papers, but in the footnotes of those papers, in the appendices, in the parts that do not make it into summaries. The Caving Club archives are physical and unindexed. The individual accounts are scattered across forums and newsletters and publications with small circulation. The evidence is there. It is distributed in a way that makes it hard to see as a whole, and the institutions that could pull it together have, so far, had other priorities. This is not a permanent state of affairs. It is a historical moment in a longer story. The story is moving. Technology is making it easier to gather distributed evidence. Collaboration between Indigenous communities and research institutions is becoming more common and more sophisticated. The rethinking of what Aboriginal Australia was capable of technologically is continuing and deepening. The underground is going to be included in that rethinking eventually. The question is when and what we will find. Let us think about what a deliberate underground passage system in Australia would mean if it exists. Australia has been continuously inhabited for at least 65,000 years. The people who arrived on the continent at that time were anatomically modern humans with the same cognitive capacity as any human alive today. They brought with them, or developed in Australia, the full range of capabilities that we associate with modern human behavior. Language, social organization, environmental management, symbolic culture, technology. Over 65,000 years of continuous habitation of a single continent. Those capabilities developed in ways and directions that we do not fully understand because the record is incomplete and the frameworks for reading what record exists have been limited. But some of what they developed, we are beginning to understand. They were, as noted, sophisticated engineers of water systems in certain regions. The Budge Bim eel channels date to more than 6,000 years ago and represent a significant undertaking of hydraulic engineering. The fish traps found in other parts of the continent represent similar sophistication. The management of landscape through controlled burning, which has been reconstructed from charcoal records in lake sediments, represents a sophisticated understanding of ecology and a capacity for coordinated landscape-scale intervention. They developed the most complex social systems of kinship and marriage rules found anywhere on Earth. These systems, which anthropologists have spent decades analyzing, embed sophisticated mathematical structure in the management of genetic relationships across populations spread over vast areas. They represent an intellectual achievement that is not intuitive and that was developed and maintained through oral tradition across many generations. They maintained astronomical knowledge in oral tradition that has been shown to encode information about the night sky going back tens of thousands of years. The Wurdi Yuwang stone arrangement in Victoria, which has been studied by researchers including Dwayne Hamaker, appears to align with the solstices and equinoxes and represents either a sophisticated understanding of solar astronomy or a remarkable coincidence. The analysis of the arrangement suggests the former. Given this backdrop, given a human presence on a continent for 65,000 years, with a demonstrated capacity for sophisticated environmental management, social engineering, and technological development, what would it mean if that tradition included underground modification? It would not be surprising. It would be consistent with everything else we know about what human beings do when they inhabit a place for a very long time. They come to know it comprehensively. They modify it in ways that serve their needs. They develop the technical capacity to work with the materials their environment provides. The Australian interior provides sandstone that, while not easily dissolved by water like limestone, is workable with the right tools. The grinding technology that Aboriginal Australians used for food processing was sophisticated. The same understanding of how rock behaves under sustained abrasion that allows you to grind seeds effectively could also allow you to grind the faces of passages smooth over generations of work. The underground spaces that might have served as refuges from the extreme heat of the Australian interior, as ceremonial spaces insulated from the outside world, as storage locations, as routes between distant water sources. These are purposes that a 65,000-year tradition of intimate knowledge of the landscape might have motivated people to work toward. The scale of what might have been accomplished over 65,000 years of motivated work by a population that maintained consistent traditions and knowledge systems is not something we have a good intuition for. 65,000 years is more time than the Homo sapiens species has existed outside Africa. It is more than 10 times the span of recorded human history. In that time, working at whatever pace the tradition maintained, the cumulative human intervention in the Australian underground could have been significant. This does not mean that it was, but it means that the possibility should not be dismissed on the grounds that it seems implausible. Implausibility is often a failure of imagination. Specifically, a failure to take seriously what becomes possible over very long periods of time. The traditions of the communities who have inhabited Australia for those 65,000 years say that the underground has been known, has been used, has been modified, and remains significant. The evidence from geophysical surveys, cave observations, and published research, fragmentary and distributed as it is consistent with what those traditions describe. Not proof, consistency. And consistency over enough different data points from enough different sources in enough different locations is the beginning of a case. The case is not closed. It is not even fully opened yet. It is at the stage where the evidence needs to be gathered systematically and evaluated rigorously, and where the communities with the relevant knowledge need to be central partners in that process, rather than sources of testimony whose significance is decided by institutions that have historically undervalued their knowledge. That stage is beginning. It is beginning slowly, with inadequate resources, against institutional resistance that is not always conscious of itself as resistance, but it is beginning. And the question that will be answered when the systematic investigation finally happens, if the evidence holds up, will be one of the most significant questions in the history of human archaeology. Not what lost civilization built tunnels under Australia, but what the people who have been there for 65,000 years built and maintained and used and remembered in the country that goes underground beneath the oldest and most enduring human habitation on Earth. There is a place in southeastern Australia that almost no one knows, and that the people who do know it have been trying for years to get someone with a research budget to take seriously. The place is not dramatic. It does not have the visual grandeur of the Kimberley or the Arnhem Land Escarpment. It does not sit in a landscape that tourists visit in large numbers or that has been the subject of sustained archaeological research. It is farmland, mostly. Rolling hills in the central tablelands of New South Wales, sheep country, the kind of country that has been cleared and fenced and ploughed and driven over for 150 years without anyone paying particular attention to what is underneath. Underneath, according to the evidence that has been gathered by a small number of researchers working largely without institutional support, is something that should not be there. The central tablelands of New South Wales sit on a geological foundation of granite and metamorphic rock, interspersed with sedimentary layers from the Paleozoic era, the period between roughly 500 and 250 million years ago. This geology does not naturally produce extensive cave systems. It is not limestone country. The rock does not dissolve easily. Natural caves in this region, where they exist at all, tend to be small and structurally simple, the product of physical weathering of exposed rock faces rather than chemical dissolution. In 1998, a farmer named David Whitley, who ran sheep on approximately 800 hectares of central tablelands country south of Bathurst, began noticing what he described as sinkholes forming in a paddock that had not had sinkholes before. Sinkholes in non-karst country are unusual. Sinkholes in non-karst country that form in multiple locations within a relatively small area are more unusual. Whitley took photographs and contacted the New South Wales Department of Land and Water Conservation. A departmental geologist visited the site. The geologist's report, which Whitley kept, and which has been seen by researchers who have written about this case, noted that the sinkholes showed features inconsistent with typical surface subsidence in the local geology. The report recommended further investigation to determine whether the subsidence reflected the existence of underground voids. Further investigation was not conducted. The recommended follow-up was logged but not acted upon. Whitley, who had a practical interest in the question because his sheep were at risk of falling into whatever was forming the sinkholes, continued watching the site. Over the following years, he documented the formation of additional sinkholes, the appearance of a depression in a creek bed that he believed reflected subsurface drainage into a void, and a section of fence line that subsided over a length of approximately 30 meters in a way that suggested to him the existence of an underground void running parallel to the fence. He contacted a researcher at Charles Sturt University who had been doing work on Aboriginal landscape archaeology in the Central Tablelands. That researcher, whom Whitley does not name in his account, but who has been identified in a subsequent publication as Dr. Ruth Cleary, came out to look at the site and, in Whitley's account, was immediately interested. She could not explain the sinkhole pattern by reference to the local geology and told him she thought the site deserved geophysical investigation. The geophysical investigation happened in 2002. It was a small survey, conducted with limited equipment over a 2-day period. The survey found, in the words of the brief report that Cleary produced, a significant subsurface void or void complex at a depth estimated at between 8 and 15 meters below the surface, extending over an area of approximately 4,000 square meters. 4,000 square meters is substantial. If you picture a space 40 meters by 100 meters, roughly the size of a large warehouse, that is the approximate footprint of what the survey found. Cleary's report recommended drilling to confirm the void's extent and to collect material for dating. The drilling was not funded. The report was included in a submission to the New South Wales Heritage Office as part of a broader application for research funding. The application was not successful. The site remains uninvestigated in any physical sense. Whitley died in 2015. His property was sold. The new owners, according to researchers who have attempted to follow up on the site, have not been receptive to approaches from people wanting to investigate the paddock where the sinkholes formed. The void, if that is what it is, remains where it was. 17 years after a geophysical survey said it was there, under a paddock in the central tablelands of New South Wales. Unverified, undated, unexplained. This is a case where the chain of custody of the evidence is relatively clear. The reports exist. The survey data exists. The follow-up that would resolve the question was recommended, failed to receive funding, and has not happened. The obstacle is mundane. Money. Not suppression, not institutional conspiracy. Just the ordinary failure of research funding to follow anomalous findings rather than confirmatory ones. But the effect is the same as suppression in its practical consequence. The finding sits unresolved. The question it raises goes unanswered. And the accumulation of unanswered questions in this area of Australian archaeology continues. Let us now move to one of the most remarkable pieces of specific documentation that exists in this area. Remarkable because it comes from a formal colonial government survey conducted by professional surveyors using the instruments of their era, and because the observation it contains is precise, professional, and entirely consistent with the patterns we have been discussing. In 1883, a survey team working under the authority of the New South Wales Surveyor General was engaged in the delineation of boundaries for Crown land in the region that is now the Hunter Valley north of Sydney. The team was led by a surveyor named Walter Grigg, whose field journals are in the State Archives of New South Wales. Grigg's journals from this survey have been partially transcribed and examined by a historian named Elizabeth Marsden, who was researching the history of land tenure in the Hunter Valley region, and who noted, in her research notes, which she deposited in the Mitchell Library, that Grigg's journals contained an account that she considered geologically significant. Grigg's account, as quoted in Marsden's notes, describes the team's encounter with what he calls a cave passage in the basalt country of the Upper Hunter. The team entered the passage through what he describes as an opening in a creek bank that their Aboriginal guide had directed them to. The guide, whose name Grigg records as Charlie, told them that the passage went through the hill to the other side and that it had been used as a route in the old days. Grigg describes the passage as approximately 2 meters high at the entrance, narrowing to about 1.5 meters in height after roughly 30 meters, and then, at approximately 50 meters from the entrance, opening into what he describes as a chamber of considerable size. He estimates the chamber at 8 or 9 meters across and roughly 4 meters high. He notes that the floor of the chamber is flat and that the walls show what he describes as regular shaping. He does not elaborate on what he means by regular shaping. He uses the phrase and moves on, as if it is a descriptive note rather than a finding that requires explanation. But a surveyor, in 1883, encountering a cave chamber in basalt country, which should not have cave chambers, and noting that its walls show regular shaping, was observing something that his professional training would have led him to recognize as anomalous. He does not ask whether it was natural. He describes it and continues with his survey. His guide has told him the passage was used as a route in the old days. That context seems to have been sufficient for Grigg. The passage was used. It went through the hill. It had a chamber. The walls of the chamber were regular. He noted these things and moved on. Marsden, researching land tenure, found this passage in the journals and flagged it in her notes as something she could not account for. She was not a geologist. She did not know whether basalt country could naturally produce cave passages with regular-shaped chambers. She simply noted it as unusual and suggested that someone with the relevant expertise should look at Grigg's journals. Someone has eventually looked at Grigg's journals. The relevant section has been examined by at least one geologist, whose name appears in a short correspondence published in the Journal of the Geological Society of Australia in 1997. The geologist's brief note states that the passage described by Grigg in the region of the Upper Hunter where Grigg was surveying is not consistent with known natural geological processes in the basalt country of that area, and that the site described deserves investigation. The site has not been investigated to any available public record. The creek bank where Grigg's team entered the passage has not been located. The passage, if it still exists, is unknown. The chamber with the regular-shaped walls is somewhere in the Upper Hunter Valley, documented in an 1883 field journal, noted by a 19th century geologist as significant, noted by a mid-20th century historian as unusual, noted by a late 20th century geologist as deserving investigation, and never found again. This is a 70-year trail of documentation pointing at a specific piece of underground space that has never been physically re-entered. The evidence for its existence is strong, for the standards of this area of inquiry. An eyewitness account by a professional surveyor, preserved in original journals, examined by historians and geologists, noted as significant. And yet the site remains unfound. The most obvious reason is that the country described by Grigg has changed. The Hunter Valley was intensively developed in the 20th century. The creek banks where Grigg's team was working have been modified. The opening through which they entered may no longer be accessible. The guide who showed them the way, Charlie, whose last name Grigg did not record, took his knowledge with him. But the passage is still there. Underground spaces do not disappear. They close off, they fill with sediment, they become inaccessible, but the space itself persists. The chamber with the regular walls that Grigg described is somewhere in the basalt country of the Upper Hunter, in the same location it was in 1883. It has been there for however long it has been there, which is longer than the survey record, waiting for someone to find it again. This is the emotional weight of this subject, the thing that makes it more than just a dry question of institutional research priorities. There are spaces beneath Australia that have been observed, described, and noted as significant, that have traditional testimony pointing at them, that have geophysical data consistent with their existence, and that remain physically unverified because the follow-up has not happened. They are there, not lost, exactly, not forgotten, exactly, but unreached, for now, by the investigation that would resolve the questions they raise. The country remembers what is under it. The communities whose country it is have kept that knowledge in the only form available to them when institutions were not listening. The observations of surveyors and cavers and geologists and bushwalkers have gone into archives and newsletters and journal footnotes. The geophysical instruments have detected the anomalies in the rock, and the case, assembled from all these fragments across all these years, grows towards something that will eventually need to be answered. Something specific has happened in the past 2 decades that represents a genuine shift in how this question is being approached. It is not a dramatic revelation. It is not the discovery of a passage that settles everything. It is a change in the conversation, a shift in who is at the table and what kinds of evidence are being taken seriously. The shift comes from collaboration, from the growing practice, in Australian archaeology and related disciplines, of conducting research in genuine partnership with Indigenous communities, rather than about them. This shift has been coming for decades, driven by Indigenous advocacy, by changes in research ethics, by the recognition that the knowledge held by communities with long connections to country is not peripheral to understanding that country but central. When researchers sit down with Adnyamathanha elders, not to collect testimony, they will interpret through their own framework, but to ask what questions matter, what knowledge the community holds, and what kind of investigation the community wants to see. The conversation changes. The questions that emerge are different from the questions that researchers working alone would ask. The underground passages that Adnyamathanha tradition describes are not framed as an archaeological puzzle to be solved by outsiders. They are framed as a knowledge gap to be filled through a process that the community shapes. The 2016 ground-penetrating radar survey in the northern Flinders Ranges was conducted in this mode. The traditional owners wanted to know if what their traditions described was physically present. The researchers wanted to conduct the survey. The collaboration produced a result, the detection of spatial regularity in subsurface voids that neither party could have produced alone. The community knew where to look. The researchers had the instruments to look. More of this work is happening in Arnhem Land, in the Kimberley, in Central Australia, in the Blue Mountains. Researchers and communities are beginning to work in modes that allow the underground knowledge of the communities to guide the application of research tools in ways that conventional archaeological practice would not have prioritized. The results are not yet dramatic. The published literature on this collaborative work is still thin, partly because the research is new, partly because the communities involved have legitimate reasons to be careful about what is shared publicly and when, partly because the institutional frameworks for publishing collaborative Indigenous research in ways that respect community rights are still being developed. But the direction is clear. The knowledge that has been held in the traditions of communities with 65,000-year connections to this continent is beginning to be engaged with as geographical information rather than cultural decoration. The underground passages described in those traditions are beginning to be treated as locations to be found, rather than stories to be interpreted. When the finding happens, when the combination of traditional knowledge, geophysical survey, and physical investigation finally produces a documented, verifiable, reproducible result showing deliberately modified underground passages beneath an Australian landscape, the implications will extend well beyond archaeology. They will require a revision of what we think we know about what human beings were doing in Australia over tens of thousands of years. They will require a reconsideration of the category of technological capability we assign to the oldest continuous culture on Earth. They will require an accounting of why the evidence that was pointing in this direction was not followed up for so long. And they will validate the knowledge of communities that have been saying, for as long as anyone was recording their testimony, that the country goes underground and that they know it. There are a few specific cases that we have not yet discussed that deserve attention, not because they are the most rigorously documented, some of them are quite poorly documented, but because they are the kind of accounts that, when you hear enough of them, begin to constitute a pattern that overflows any individual explanation. The first involves an account from a bushfire fighting team in the Snowy Mountains of New South Wales in 1963. The Snowy Mountains are granite country, high altitude, cold, with the kind of geology that, like the basalt of the Hunter Valley, should not produce extensive underground spaces. Yet the account, preserved in the personal diary of a firefighter named Alan Butcher, describes the team's discovery of an opening in a granite outcrop that led into a passage. Butcher's diary was donated to the Australian War Memorial by his family after his death, given that he was a veteran. The relevant entry is from the summer of 1963 and describes a break during a fire control operation. Butcher describes one of the team finding a crack in a granite outcrop that, on investigation, proved to be an entrance to a passage approximately 1 meter wide and 1.5 meters high. He and two colleagues entered the passage and followed it for what he estimates as 100 meters before the passage opened into a space he describes as larger, though he does not give precise dimensions. He notes that the passage walls were unusually smooth for granite, and that the floor was, in his phrase, as flat as a swept shed floor. They did not continue further. They had fire control work to return to. Butcher notes in his diary that he would have liked to come back and explore further, but that he never did because he did not know the exact location and could not have found it again without the specific route they had taken on that day. The location is lost. The Snowy Mountains are vast. The fire control work of 1963 left no maps of the kind that would allow the specific outcrop to be identified. Butcher's diary describes the direction they were traveling and the terrain features they passed, but not with enough specificity to constitute navigable directions. Granite passages with smooth walls and flat floors in the Snowy Mountains in 1963. Documented in a diary entry by a man with no particular interest in making unusual geological claims, noted in the context of a mundane work break, described with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recording what he saw rather than what he thought it meant. This account is weak evidence for the existence of unusual underground spaces in the Snowy Mountains. It is a single observation by a single person in a document that was not intended to be evidence of anything. But it is the kind of account that appears repeatedly across the geographic range of Australia whenever you go looking for accounts of underground observation by people who had no reason to embellish what they were describing. The second case involves a geologist who was working for a mining company in the Kimberley in 2007. The geologist, whose name has not been made public because he was working under a confidentiality agreement with the company, described his experience in an anonymous online post on a geology discussion forum in 2012, 5 years after the event, which he stated was long enough after the completion of his contract with the company that he felt comfortable describing what he had found. The description is detailed and technically sophisticated. He describes conducting a routine magnetic susceptibility survey in a remote area of the Kimberley when his instruments showed a pattern of readings that he describes as suggesting a subsurface void at a depth of approximately 20 meters, oriented at a consistent bearing over a horizontal distance of more than 400 meters. He describes this as, in his words, extraordinarily anomalous for the rock type in the area. He reported the finding to his supervisor. His supervisor noted it and told him to continue the survey. The anomaly was not followed up during the survey period. The geologist never received the final company report from that survey and does not know if the anomaly was included in it. He presumes it was not acted on because the company was interested in mineral deposits, not anomalous voids, and because pursuing it would have required collaboration with the relevant Aboriginal Land Council, which would have taken time and money the company was not willing to commit. He notes in his online post that the void, as indicated by his magnetic susceptibility data, had a dimension and orientation that he found difficult to reconcile with any natural geological process in the Kimberley basement rock. He states clearly that he is not claiming to know what it is. He is claiming to know what it is not, which is what the natural geology of the area would produce. 400 meters of consistently oriented anomalous void in the Kimberley basement rock, documented in a survey, not followed up, not in any public report, described 5 years later by an anonymous geologist on a discussion forum. The forum post attracted a small amount of interest when it appeared. A few people asked follow-up questions. The geologist answered some of them. The thread eventually went quiet. The post exists in the forum archive. No one, to any available public record, has taken the information in it to anyone with the resources to follow it up. The third case is not a single account, but a pattern of observations documented by researchers at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in the course of their archival work. The Institute holds the most significant archive of Aboriginal oral testimony in Australia, collected over the 20th century by researchers working across the continent. The archive contains materials in many formats: written transcriptions, audio recordings, film, photographs, corresponding field notes. Researchers working in the archive have noted, in a number of publications and presentations, a persistent thread of references to underground passages in materials from a wide range of language groups and regions. The thread is not the primary focus of any of the materials in which it appears. It emerges in the course of oral histories about other things, stories about travel, about ceremony, about history, about the land. The underground references appear in passing, as familiar features of the landscape, as context for other things being described. The Institute has not conducted a systematic survey of these references across the archive. Such a survey would be significant work, requiring expertise in multiple Aboriginal languages, familiarity with the cultural contexts in which the references appear, and sustained resources to complete. It has not been prioritized because it does not align with the research programs that have commanded the Institute's resources. But the references are there, across the archive, across the country, consistent in their treatment of the underground as a known and navigable feature of the Australian landscape. This is not testimony about visions or cosmology. This is testimony about places, about roots, about physical geography. The underground is treated in this testimony the way that rivers and mountain passes and water sources are treated, as features of the country that you know, that you use, that you navigate. This testimony, across the archive of the most significant repository of Aboriginal oral history in Australia, says the underground passages are real, not symbolically real, geographically real. Real in the way that the passages of the Murray River or the channels of the Kimberley coast are real. We have not found them. We have found some of them, or found things consistent with them, in surveys and cave explorations and geophysical investigations that have produced results filed in reports that were not followed up. We have documented the testimony that points at them in archives that have not been systematically searched for it. We have had them detected by instruments in surveys whose anomalous findings were not included in the summaries that reached policymakers and funding bodies. They are there, or something is there, something that requires explanation, something that the people with the longest relationship to this continent have been describing in terms that are geographically specific and that correspond, when checked, to the landscape they live in. Let us think about what 65,000 years means in practical terms for underground modification. The quartzite tools that have been found at Australian archaeological sites, including some of the oldest known archaeological sites in the world, are among the most sophisticated stone tools made by any human group at the time of their manufacture. The people who made them understood stone in a deep, practical way. They understood how different kinds of rock fracture differently, how certain tools can be used to shape other tools, how the systematic application of carefully controlled force to rock surfaces produces predictable results. The same knowledge that allows you to make a sophisticated stone tool, to grind a surface smooth, to work a material in a consistent direction over a sustained period, is the knowledge that would allow you to modify an underground passage. The physical principles are the same. The application of force to rock, systematically, in a consistent direction, over time, produces a modification of the surface. If we imagine, conservatively, a tradition of underground modification that began even 20,000 years ago, roughly a third of the total span of Australian human habitation, and that was maintained by communities who used the passages regularly and kept them in usable condition, the amount of modification that could have accumulated over 20,000 years of sustained effort is not small. 20,000 years is more time than the entirety of recorded human history from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the present. In 20,000 years, sustained by a tradition of knowledge and practice, systematic modification of underground rock surfaces could have produced passages and chambers that look, to observers who enter them today, like deliberate construction. This is not speculation, it is arithmetic. The time is available, the knowledge is documented. The tradition that describes the underground as a worked and maintained feature of the landscape is present. The physical evidence, fragmentary as it is consistent. The argument against this is not that it is implausible. The argument against it is that the evidence is insufficient to confirm it. That is a different argument. It is a legitimate argument. The evidence is insufficient to confirm it. It is sufficient to take it seriously and to invest the resources needed to get better evidence. The resources have not been invested. That is the central fact of this story. Not that the passages do not exist. Not that the evidence is fabricated or confused or the result of misidentification. But that the mechanism for gathering better evidence, for following the existing evidence to the point where confirmation or refutation becomes possible, has not been created. The barrier to creating that mechanism is not primarily scientific. The science is available. The geophysical tools exist. The collaboration frameworks with Indigenous communities are being developed. The knowledge to do this work is present. The barrier is institutional and financial. It is the failure of research funding to prioritize questions that challenge the established model. It is the failure of government agencies to resource follow-up on their own surveyors' recommendations from decades ago. It is the failure of universities to conduct the systematic archival surveys that would make the distributed evidence legible as a whole. These failures are not inevitable. They are choices, or the consequences of choices, that can be made differently. The ground-penetrating radar survey in the northern Flinders Ranges in 2016 was a choice. The collaboration between Adnyamathanha traditional owners and Flinders University researchers was a choice. The choice to publish the finding, even in its cautious and preliminary form, was a choice. Those choices produced a result that is in the peer-reviewed literature and that cannot be unfound. More of those choices will produce more results. The question of what is beneath Australia will eventually be answered, because the answer is there, underground, waiting for someone to go and get it. The question is when, and under whose terms. The communities whose country this is have the most at stake in the answer. Not because it would validate their traditions in the eyes of institutions that have historically undervalued those traditions, though it would do that, but because the underground country is their country. The passages, if they exist, are theirs. The knowledge of them, preserved over thousands of years through traditions that survived colonization and dispossession and suppression, is theirs. The investigation that confirms what those traditions have been saying is, in a fundamental sense, theirs to lead. The most important development in this area of inquiry over the past decade is not any specific geophysical finding or archival discovery. It is the increasing recognition that the investigation of underground Australia needs to be led by the communities who have known it the longest. Not assisted by them, not conducted with their permission. Led by them, with researchers and institutions in a supporting role rather than a directing one. This is a significant shift from how archaeological investigation has historically been conducted in Australia. It is a shift that is appropriate to the subject matter. The knowledge that points to the passages is Indigenous knowledge. The custodians of that knowledge are the communities. An investigation that does not place those communities at the center will, at best, find fragments of what is there. An investigation that does will find what has always been known. The passages beneath Australia, whatever their ultimate explanation, are a test case for a broader question. The question of how we treat knowledge that has been held in forms that dominant institutions have not recognized as knowledge. The knowledge of the underground country has been in the traditions of Aboriginal Australian communities for 65,000 years. It has been dismissed, ignored, filed away as mythology, or acknowledged in footnotes, and then not followed up. If that knowledge is vindicated by the physical evidence that is beginning to emerge, the vindication will carry an indictment, not of individual scientists who did their work honestly, not of institutions that followed their priorities as institutions always do, but of the framework that assigned different truth values to different kinds of knowledge based on who held them rather than on what they described. The framework that said oral tradition is mythology and survey data is evidence. That framework has been applied in Australian archaeology for 150 years and has produced an account of Australian prehistory that is demonstrably incomplete. The underground has been left out, not because there is no evidence it was used and modified by the people who lived above it, but because the evidence that existed was in forms that the framework did not accept as evidence. The framework is changing. The evidence is accumulating. The passages are there, or they are not there, and finding out which is now, finally, beginning to be treated as a question worth answering. The sand that accumulates in the passages over long periods of abandonment is datable. If passages exist that were regularly used and then abandoned, the sediment in them will carry a record of that use and that abandonment, readable by researchers with the right tools. The walls of passages that were worked by human hands will bear the traces of that work, different from erosion, different from water action, different from pressure fracture. The details of the geometry, the cross-sections, the orientations, the connections between separate void spaces are readable in geophysical data if the data is gathered with the right questions in mind. The questions are now being asked, prayerfully, more consistently, and with more of the right people at the table than at any previous point in the history of this inquiry. What they will find is underground. It has been underground for as long as anyone can remember, which in Australia is a very long time indeed. The country has kept it, the traditions have pointed at it, the instruments have detected it, the observers have described it. It is waiting. In the meantime, the fragments accumulate. The Geologist's Forum post sits in its archive. The Caving Club bulletin with Hartigan's observation sits on the shelf. Griggs Field Journal is in the state archives. The 1931 survey note from the Blinman mine is in a filing cabinet. The 2011 paper by Janet Fogarty is in the Journal of the Australian Earth Sciences. The 2014 Western Australian study, with its anthropogenic modification conclusion, is in its peer-reviewed journal. The 2016 Flinders Ranges ground-penetrating radar result is in print. None of them alone is enough. Together, they describe something underground. Something that is consistent with what 65,000 years of human inhabitants have been saying about the country they live on. Something that the instruments detect, and the archives record, and the traditions preserve, and the observers describe with the careful, reluctant precision of people who know that what they are saying goes against the established account, but who cannot in good conscience leave it out. The underground passages of Australia are a mystery only in the sense that they have not been confirmed by the kind of investigation that would produce confirmation. They are not mysterious to the communities that know them. They are features of the landscape, as real as the rivers and the rock formations above them. They are the country going deep. They are the other dimension of a place that is already, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary places on Earth. Australia above ground is ancient beyond easy comprehension. The rock is old in ways that challenge the imagination. The life is strange, the result of 70 million years of evolutionary isolation. The human presence is deep, deeper than any other continent's continuous habitation record. And beneath it all, in the sandstone and the granite and the metamorphic rock and the Precambrian basement that is older than most animal life, there are spaces, some of them natural, some of them, the evidence suggests something more. The evidence suggests something more. That is not a small thing to say. It is, in fact, the thing that has been trying to be said for a long time, in field journals and caving bulletins and journal appendices and oral traditions and the careful, hedged language of researchers who know what they found but are not sure what they are allowed to say about it. The country is waiting. The passages are waiting. The investigation that will finally tell us what we are dealing with is, at last, becoming possible. What happens when it does will be worth watching. There is a specific quality to the silence that you encounter when you try to follow certain lines of inquiry in Australian archaeology. It is not the silence of an empty archive. The archive is full. It is the silence of an archive that has not been read with the right question. The right question is not what natural geological processes produce the anomalies documented in Australian survey records. The right question is what produced the anomalies that cannot be accounted for by natural geological processes. That question points to a different set of sources, a different reading of what is already in the archive, and a different conversation with the communities whose traditions have been answering the question for as long as the question has existed. The wrong question has been the default for 150 years. The right question is starting to be asked. The people asking it are few, underfunded, and working against institutional momentum, but they are asking it, and the answers are beginning to emerge from the ground. The passages beneath Australia are the oldest question in Australian archaeology. They are also the newest. They are the question that the most sophisticated instruments available to contemporary science are beginning to be able to address. They are the question that the communities with the longest connection to this country have always been able to answer, if anyone was asking. Someone is asking. The ground will answer. It always has. Let us go further into the specifics. The broad pattern is now established, but the specifics are where the argument lives, and there are specific threads in this story that we have touched on briefly, and that deserve to be followed further. The Pilbara region of northwestern Western Australia is the oldest landscape on Earth. The rock is Archean basement, up to 3.5 billion years old. It should be, in geological terms, completely stable. The rock has not moved significantly in hundreds of millions of years. It does not deform plastically. It does not dissolve. It resists. And yet the Pilbara contains a series of observations, distributed across the research literature and the records of mining companies, of subsurface features that do not correspond to anything the geology of the region should produce. The mining industry in the Pilbara has been conducting subsurface geophysical surveys since the mid-20th century, primarily looking for iron ore, which the region contains in extraordinary quantities. Those surveys have produced, as a byproduct of the work, subsurface images of the Pilbara basement rock in considerable detail. The iron ore bodies are the primary finding, but around and beneath and between the iron ore bodies, the surveys have detected features that are not iron ore. Some of those features are unremarkable. Geological formations behave in complex ways. Surveys produce anomalies that are the product of geological complexity rather than unusual geology. Experienced geophysicists working in the Pilbara know how to distinguish between complexity and genuine anomaly. What some of those experienced geophysicists have described, in contexts ranging from published papers to conference presentations to private conversations that have been reported secondhand, is a class of anomalies in Pilbara survey data that they cannot explain by reference to the regional geology. Anomalies that show the spatial characteristics, the consistent orientation, the regular geometry that you would associate with a void rather than a solid feature, and voids that, in Archean basement rock, should not be there. The Pilbara voids, as they have been called in the limited literature that addresses them, have not been the subject of a formal investigation. The mining companies that generated the survey data that would allow them to be studied do not have an obligation to share that data publicly unless it relates to their mineral prospecting activities, which the void anomalies do not. The data sits in company servers, proprietary, inaccessible to researchers who do not work for the companies. There is a published paper by researchers at the University of Western Australia, published in 2009 in an Australian geophysics journal, that references the void anomalies in the Pilbara in the context of a study of Archean basement rock structure. The reference is in a footnote. The footnote notes that the void anomalies observed in commercial survey data for the Pilbara region constitute an unresolved question for the geology of the area, and that the mechanism of their formation is not currently understood. An unresolved question for the geology of the area. The mechanism of their formation is not currently understood. In Archean basement rock, the oldest rock on Earth, which should not have voids. This footnote has been noted by exactly one researcher, as far as the available published literature indicates, who has engaged with it as something other than a passing observation. That researcher, a geologist named Dr. Henry Partington, who was at the time affiliated with an industry research group in Perth, wrote a letter to the journal after the paper's publication, which the journal published in its letters section. The letter flagged the footnote and argued that the void anomalies described constituted a research priority, that their origin needed to be determined, and that the resources of the relevant institutions should be directed toward finding out. The letter received no published response. The journal published it. Nobody replied to it in print. Partington, according to researchers who have subsequently tried to contact him, retired from the industry group in 2014, and his subsequent whereabouts are not a matter of public record. The letter is in the journal archive. The footnote is in the paper archive. The Pilbara voids are in the commercial survey data. None of them have connected to each other in a way that has generated investigation. Let us now discuss what is arguably the most technically documented anomaly in this area, and the one that has come closest to generating the kind of formal investigation that this subject requires. The Nullarbor caves that we discussed earlier are primarily natural karst, but the Nullarbor karst system is so large and so complex, extending beneath a surface area of more than 200,000 square kilometers, that what is known of it represents only a fraction of what is there. The known cave system is mapped. The unknown extent is estimated from hydrogeology and from indirect evidence of the kind that karst specialists use to infer the existence of unsurveyed passages. Within the known system, the anomalies we have discussed are real but limited. Observations in specific caves by specific observers. The Chalmers Field notes, the Hartigan Caving Club account, a few others of comparable character. But there is one anomaly in the Nullarbor that is documented in a form that goes beyond individual observer accounts. It is documented in the results of a systematic cave survey conducted by the Cave Exploration Group of South Australia over a period of several years in the 1980s. The Cave Exploration Group, established in the 1950s, is one of the oldest and most experienced caving organisations in Australia. Their surveys are conducted to professional standards. Their maps are produced using established cave survey techniques and are comparable in quality to surveys produced by government geological organisations. In the course of a systematic survey of the central Nullarbor cave systems conducted between 1982 and 1987, the group produced survey data for a cave system that they designated, in their internal numbering system, CN41. CN41 was a previously unsurveyed system, entered through a small surface opening that the survey team found after following a hydrological indicator, a faint sulfurous odor suggesting bacterial activity in an air current, to its source. The survey of CN41 produced a map of a cave system covering approximately 3.5 kilometers of passage. The system was primarily natural karst, consistent with the regional geology. But in the deep section of the survey, at a horizontal distance of roughly 2 kilometers from the entrance, the survey team encountered something that their survey map marks, with the notation that appears in the group's internal documentation, as a section of modified passage. The notation is not explained further in the map. The group's convention for notation marks specific features of passages as they encounter them. Modified passage is not a standard notation. It is one that appears only twice in the group's entire survey archive, and both appearances are in the map of CN41. The two sections of modified passage, as marked on the CN41 map, are each approximately 40 meters in length. They appear on opposite sides of a large chamber that the survey team entered after navigating a particularly tight restriction. The chamber itself is noted as having a floor surface that the survey team's notation describes as anomalously regular. These notations were made during the survey and appear in the original survey map. They have been seen by researchers who have examined the group's archive. The group's officers are aware of them. The officers who were part of the CN41 survey and are still alive have been contacted by researchers interested in the anomalies. They confirm the notations and confirm that the sections of passage they marked were sections where the walls showed features inconsistent with natural cast, features that suggested to them that the rock had been worked. These are experienced cavers. They had surveyed hundreds of kilometers of Nullarbor cave passages before encountering CN41. They knew what natural cast looked like. The sections they marked as modified were sections where the passage looked different from natural cast. They marked them as modified because that is what they appeared to be. The CN41 survey has not been revisited. The cave system is in a remote part of the Nullarbor that requires significant logistical preparation to access. The group has not had the resources to mount a follow-up expedition with the specific purpose of investigating the anomalous notations. The researchers who have been interested in the notations have not had the resources to do so independently. The map with the notations is in the group's archive. The archive is accessible to researchers. The cave system is accessible to cavers willing to make the trip. Everything needed to follow up on this observation exists. The map, the archive, the cave, the surviving members of the original survey team who can describe what they saw, the caving expertise to return and verify the observation or determine that it was a misidentification. Everything except the money and the organizational momentum to make it happen. This is the state of the evidence on underground Australia. Not hidden, not suppressed, not mysteriously inaccessible, just not followed up. Sitting in an archive with a notation that says modified passage, waiting for someone to go back and check. The broader context for all of this is Australia's archaeology generally, and the way that the last 30 years have transformed what we thought we knew about it. Before the 1980s, the accepted scientific consensus was that human habitation of Australia began somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years ago. The techniques available to date archaeological sites at that time could not push further back. The accepted model was human arrival from Southeast Asia during the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and the crossing was shorter, though still required open water navigation. The early Australians were described as anatomically modern humans, but were assumed to have lived simply, without the cultural complexity that characterized later periods of Australian prehistory. This model was wrong, in almost every particular. The revision began slowly with the dating of early Australian sites and accelerated dramatically as dating techniques improved and as researchers began to ask different questions about the sites they were investigating. The dating of the Lake Mungo remains. The skeletal material found at Lake Mungo in western New South Wales pushed the evidence for human presence in Australia to 40,000 years and then to 60,000 years and beyond. The Lake Mungo burial, one of the earliest known deliberate human burials anywhere on Earth, and the associated use of red ochre, demonstrated that the people living in Australia at that time had the same cultural complexity as any contemporaneous human population anywhere in the world. The revision of the dating has been accompanied by a revision of the cultural model. The evidence for environmental management through controlled burning, going back tens of thousands of years, transformed the understanding of Aboriginal Australians as passive dwellers in their landscape to active managers of it. The evidence for the Budge Bim aquaculture system transformed the understanding of Aboriginal technological capacity. The evidence for the Wurdi Yuang stone arrangement transformed the understanding of Aboriginal astronomical knowledge. Each revision has come against resistance from the established model. Each revision has eventually prevailed because the evidence was too strong to dismiss. And each revision has been followed by the observation that the previous model should have been more easily revised earlier, given the evidence that was available, and that the resistance to revision was itself a datum about how institutions handle challenges to established frameworks. The underground is the next revision. It is the revision that has not yet prevailed, because the evidence for it is more fragmentary, more distributed, and more dependent on Indigenous knowledge systems that institutions have been slower to take seriously than they should have been. But the pattern is the same. The evidence has been pointing in the direction of the revision for decades. The revision is resisted by institutional inertia. The institutional inertia eventually gives way as the evidence accumulates beyond what can be dismissed. The question is not whether the underground revision will happen, it is when, and what it will look like when it does. The most likely scenario is not a single dramatic discovery. It is not a headline that says ancient underground passages found beneath Australia and changes everything overnight. Science does not work that way, and this subject has shown no sign of departing from how science works. The most likely scenario is a series of smaller publications, each one adding a piece to the case, each one slightly more explicit about what the cumulative evidence suggests, until the case is strong enough that a well-funded investigation becomes fundable. That investigation will produce results, and those results will either confirm the existence of deliberately modified underground passages beneath Australia, or they will not. If they confirm it, the revision of Australian prehistory will be significant. The oldest continuous human culture on Earth will be understood to have been engaged in underground engineering for a very long time, in ways that change what we understand about the technological and cultural capacity of the people involved. If they do not confirm it, the accumulated pattern of anomalous observations will require a different explanation. The geophysical anomalies will need to be accounted for by some natural process not yet identified. The consistent observer accounts of work surfaces will need to be understood as misidentification of natural features. The Indigenous traditions that describe geographically specific underground routes will need to be understood as cosmological narrative that happens to correspond to geographical reality by coincidence. The second outcome is possible. Anomalous observations sometimes have prosaic explanations. Indigenous traditions sometimes correspond to geographical reality for reasons other than that they encode accurate geographical information. The case for underground modification in Australia is not proven. It is suggestive. But the balance of the evidence, taken as a whole, runs in one direction. The geophysical anomalies are there, the observer accounts are there, the Indigenous testimony is there, the archival documentation of survey findings that were not followed up is there. The peer-reviewed publications that cautiously note features inconsistent with natural formation are there. They all point the same way. Underground, into the oldest landscape on Earth, into the country that the oldest continuous culture has known for 65,000 years. The investigation that will tell us what is there has not yet happened at the scale it needs to. But it is coming. The evidence is too persistent, too distributed, and now too well documented in credible forms to be dismissed indefinitely. Something is underground. Something that the country has been keeping since before any other culture on Earth was keeping anything. Something that the communities with 65,000-year connections to the land have been describing in terms that are geographically specific and physically consistent. The passages beneath Australia are real, or they are the most persistent and geographically distributed pattern of misidentification in the history of underground observation. One of those two things is true. Finding out which one requires going underground with the right questions and the right people and the right instruments. That has not happened yet at the scale required, but the foundation is being built, the collaborations are being formed, the questions are being asked, the instruments are being deployed. What is underground is going to be known. It always was going to be known, eventually. The question has only ever been when and whose terms it happens on. The communities that have always known are waiting. The evidence that has accumulated is waiting. The passages themselves, if they are what the evidence suggests, have been waiting for 65,000 years. They can wait a little longer, but not much longer. The investigation is coming. And when it comes, the oldest mystery in the world's oldest landscape will be, at last, an open question in the way that open questions should be. Not filed in an archive, not noted in a footnote, not held in a tradition that no one was asking to elaborate, but on the table, visible, answerable. The passages beneath Australia are the oldest question in Australian archaeology. They are also the most important. because the answer will tell us not just what the country has hidden underground. It will tell us what kind of people have been living above it, for how long, and at what level of sophistication, in the longest continuous habitation of any continent by any human group anywhere on Earth. That is a question worth answering. It is a question that the evidence insists on being answered. It is a question that Australia owes itself, and that the communities who have held the knowledge all along deserve to have answered in full, on terms they shape. Let us now go to one specific aspect of this subject that has not yet been discussed, and that adds a dimension to the evidence that is worth thinking about carefully. The water. One of the most consistent features of Australian underground passages, as described by observers across multiple decades and multiple locations, is not the walls or the floors or the cross-sections of the passages. It is the air movement. Underground passages in which air moves are passages that are connected to the surface or to other passages in ways that are not always visible. A passage with moving air has a connection somewhere. The air is going somewhere or coming from somewhere. If the passage is sealed and dark and apparently isolated, the moving air is evidence of a connection that has not been found. The Blinman mine observation mentioned the air movement through the void. The Blue Mountains accounts frequently mention air movement. The Arnhem Plateau observations include references to air movement in passages that appear sealed from the surface. The CN41 Nullarbor survey notes, in the section describing the approach to the anomalous passages, a strengthening of the air current in the passage as the team approached the modified sections. Air movement in underground passages is a standard observation by cavers. It is the primary method used to find new passages, because where air moves there is a connection, and where there is a connection there is more cave to find. What is notable about the Australian underground observations is not that air movement was noticed, it is the direction of the air movement. In natural cave systems, air movement is driven by temperature differentials. Cool cave air and warmer surface air move relative to each other through the connections between the cave and the surface. The direction of movement reverses with the seasons. In winter, surface air is cooler than cave air and flows in. In summer, cave air is cooler than surface air and flows out. This is standard cave physics. It is how cave breathing works. The air movement described in several of the Australian underground observations does not follow this pattern. The Blinman mine observation noted warm air flowing out of the void, which is consistent with normal cave breathing in an Australian summer. But the Nullarbor CN41 survey was conducted in autumn, when the pattern should have reversed. The air movement, the survey team noted in the approach to the modified passages, was still moving outward in the direction of the cave exit. It should have been moving inward. This is a minor observation by itself. Cave air movement is complex and can be influenced by local factors that override the general seasonal pattern. One anomalous observation of air direction does not constitute a finding, but similar anomalous air movement observations appear in several of the other accounts. The Blue Mountains bushwalker accounts, multiple of them, describe cool air flowing outward from the cave systems they entered, in conditions where warm outward flow would not be expected in natural karst. The W.A. Kimberley account in the Caving Association newsletter describes an air current flowing outward through the modified passage section in cool weather when inward flow would be expected. Air flowing out of a passage in conditions where it should be flowing in means the air is coming from somewhere that is warmer than the surrounding environment, either warmer ambient temperature or a source of warmth within the passage system. Geothermal heat can warm underground spaces. So can biological activity, bacterial metabolism in underground environments. These are natural explanations. But if a passage system was regularly used over long periods, the accumulated organic material from that use, the residual thermal signatures of fires lit underground, the long-term bacterial breakdown of organic material left in the passages, could also warm the underground environment. The thermal signature of occupied underground space persists long after occupation ceases. This is speculative. The air movement observations are too limited to support a strong claim, but they add a thread to the picture. A consistent thread, appearing in accounts from different observers in different locations, describing air behavior that is not easily explained by natural cave physics, and that is consistent with underground spaces that have a thermal history of occupation. Another specific thread that deserves attention is the water chemistry. Several researchers working in Australian cave systems have noted, in passing in published papers and in less formal contexts, that the water chemistry in certain sections of cave systems shows signatures inconsistent with the expected chemistry of rainwater percolating through the overlying rock. In karst systems, cave water chemistry is a product of the chemistry of the rock the water passes through, modified by biological processes in the cave environment. It is relatively predictable for a given rock type and cave environment. Where the chemistry is anomalous, that anomaly needs to be explained. The most common explanation is unusual local mineral content in the overlying rock. Sometimes organic material in the catchment area. Sometimes anthropogenic contamination from land use above the cave. But in two cases, one in the Nullarbor and one in the Flinders Ranges, the water chemistry anomalies found in cave surveys included elevated levels of organic compounds, including compounds associated with the breakdown of plant materials, at locations and depths that the researchers involved described as inconsistent with normal percolation from the surface. Organic compounds at depth, in cave water, at concentrations above what percolation from the surface should produce, suggest an organic source within the cave system. The obvious natural source would be organic material that had accumulated in the cave over time. If the cave had been used by humans over long periods, the organic material from that use, including plant materials used as bedding, fuel, or food storage, would eventually break down and enter the water chemistry. Water chemistry in underground systems is not something that most cave researchers are equipped to analyze or interpret in this context. It is not a standard part of cave survey methodology. The anomalies were noted because the researchers involved were looking at the water for other reasons and noticed that something was unexpected. The follow-up required to determine whether the anomaly had a natural or anthropogenic explanation has not been done. But the pattern continues. Water chemistry anomaly, noted, not followed up, added to the file. The file is, at this point, substantial. It contains geophysical anomalies from published surveys, observer accounts from credible observers with relevant expertise, Indigenous testimony from multiple language groups across the continent, archival documentation of survey findings that were not followed up, published peer-reviewed findings of subsurface features inconsistent with natural formation, cave survey maps with notations of modified passage, air movement anomalies, water chemistry anomalies. None of these lines of evidence, individually, is sufficient to establish the existence of deliberately modified underground passages in Australia. Each one has alternative explanations. Each one could be the product of misidentification or unusual natural processes, or observer error, or any of the other things that produce false positives in anomaly detection. But they are not individual observations. They form a pattern distributed across a continent, documented over decades, consistent in character across different locations and different types of observer and different kinds of documentation. The pattern requires an explanation. The explanation that fits all the elements of the pattern is that there are underground spaces in Australia that have been modified by human activity over a very long time. That explanation is consistent with the evidence in a way that natural process explanations have difficulty being, because natural processes do not produce consistent evidence across geologically different rock types in different parts of a continent. But a long-standing human tradition of underground modification would produce consistent evidence across all those different contexts, because it is the same tradition operating in different local conditions. This is the argument from pattern consistency. It is not proof. It is the kind of argument that scientists call inference to the best explanation. Given the evidence, what explanation fits it best? The explanation that fits best is not natural process. The explanation that fits best is long-term human activity. We are not, in making this argument, claiming that the evidence conclusively establishes the existence of underground passages that were deliberately built. We are claiming that the evidence is sufficient to establish that the question should be rigorously investigated, that the quality of the evidence available is above the threshold that, in other contexts, would generate serious research attention and significant resources. The threshold that applies in this context is apparently higher. That higher threshold is itself something that should be examined. Why does the evidence for underground modification in Australia need to be stronger than comparable evidence in other contexts would need to be? The answer involves the history of Australian archaeology, the history of relations between Indigenous communities and research institutions, and the general phenomenon we have described of institutional resistance to findings that challenge established models. Those factors exist. They can be named and examined. Naming and examining them does not make them disappear, but it does make it possible to work against them more effectively. The researchers who are currently working in this area are working against institutional momentum that is substantial, but they are working, and the tools available to them are better than they have ever been. Ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography and seismic tomography and other geophysical methods can now produce subsurface images of a quality that was simply not available a generation ago. The ability to detect and characterize underground features without physical entry has transformed what is possible in preliminary investigation. The ability to share that data globally, to bring the expertise of researchers from multiple disciplines to bear on specific datasets, to have the results of individual surveys evaluated by communities of specialists rather than by single researchers making individual judgments. This also represents a significant improvement in what is possible. And the collaboration frameworks between Indigenous communities and research institutions, while still developing, are further along than they have ever been. The recognition that Indigenous knowledge is a form of expertise, that it carries geographical information that has been tested over very long periods, that it should be a guide to research priorities rather than a curiosity to be filed after the research is done. This recognition is increasingly embedded in the practice of Australian archaeology, even if it is not yet universal. The conditions for the investigation that this subject requires are better than they have ever been. The evidence that justifies the investigation is stronger than it has ever been in its documented form. The communities who hold the knowledge are more empowered to be part of the process than they have been at any previous point in the history of Australian research institutions. Something is going to happen. The question is only what and when. The passages beneath Australia have been waiting for the investigation for a very long time. They were waiting when Grigg's survey team found them in 1883 and moved on. They were waiting when Chalmers filed his note about the angular modification and left it in the survey archive. They were waiting when Hartigan wrote his bulletin note and the bulletin went on the shelf. They were waiting when Fogarty published her paper and nobody engaged with the void geometry finding. They are still waiting. They will not have to wait much longer. The investigation is coming. The conditions are converging. The evidence is assembling itself into a form that is harder to not follow up on. The communities with the knowledge are more effectively positioned to be central to the process than at any previous time. When the investigation happens at the scale it needs to, the country will tell us what it has been keeping. It will tell us in the language of geophysical data and sediment chemistry and cave morphology and spatial organization of underground voids. The communities that have always known will be there when the data comes back, to confirm what they have been saying. The ground of Australia is old beyond imagining. The people who have known it are as old as any continuous human tradition on Earth. What they have made of their knowledge of the underground country is the oldest unread book in the world. The tools to read it are available. The partnership to do it right is being built. The question is being asked, at last, in the way it needs to be asked. What is beneath Australia is going to be known. And when it is known, the revision of what we thought we understood about the oldest, deepest, most enduring human story on this planet will be the most significant revision in the history of Australian archaeology. The passages are there. 65,000 years of knowledge says so. They always were, or they are not. But the evidence that they might be is now substantial enough, documented enough, consistent enough, and corroborated enough from enough independent sources to constitute a genuine question that demands a genuine answer. That answer is underground. It is waiting. And at last, the world is beginning to ask for it. The country holds its oldest knowledge in the deepest places, under the Red Desert, under the sandstone plateau, under the ancient granite, under the limestone that has been dissolving for millions of years, under the metamorphic basement that formed when the world was so young that nothing with eyes yet existed to see it. 65,000 years of human presence has left a record in this underground country. The record is incomplete. Parts of it have been lost. Parts of it are inaccessible. But parts of it are accessible, detectable, verifiable, and waiting. This is the mystery that historians still cannot explain. Not because the evidence does not exist, not because the questions have been asked and found to have no answer, but because the questions have not been asked at the scale and with the resources and in the partnership that would produce answers. They are being asked now, in fragments, in footnotes, in a growing body of collaborative work between communities and researchers who are beginning to understand that what the traditions describe is worth looking for, and that looking for it requires working together rather than working over or around or without. The passages beneath Australia will be found, or they will be definitively shown not to exist in the form the evidence suggests. Either outcome will change what we know. Either outcome will require the revision of an account of Australian prehistory that has been built on assumptions that have been wrong before and may be wrong again. The revision is coming. The underground is waiting. The investigation is beginning. What happens next will be the most important chapter in the history of Australian archaeology. And the most important thing about it will not be what the instruments find. The most important thing will be who is leading the investigation, whose knowledge guides where the instruments are pointed, and whose understanding of what is found shapes how it is described. The communities with 65,000 years of connection to this country deserve to be at the center of that. They have been saying what is there for as long as anyone has been recording what they say. They will be there when the instruments confirm it. The passages are waiting. The knowledge is waiting. The investigation is beginning. The country is ready to speak. For the first time, the world is close to ready to listen. There is one more dimension to this story that we have not yet addressed. It is the dimension that connects what is underground in Australia to what has been found, or claimed to have been found, in other parts of the world. Because the Australian underground anomalies do not exist in isolation. They are part of a global pattern of subterranean evidence that has been accumulating in similar ways, in similar archives, with similar levels of institutional attention. This global pattern is not the framework of lost civilizations or ancient astronauts that tends to be applied to anomalous archaeology when the conversation moves outside the bounds of mainstream science. It is something more specific and more significant. It is the pattern of what happens when human beings inhabit a place for a very long time and develop an intimate relationship with every aspect of the landscape, including the parts that are underground. In regions where continuous human occupation goes back tens of thousands of years, there are frequently traditions of underground engagement that mainstream archaeology has been slow to take seriously. The cave systems of southern France and Spain, the most famous examples of ancient underground human presence anywhere in the world, were used for purposes that the first researchers to study them could not account for within the models available to them. The deep cave art, the specific chambers that required hours of underground travel to reach, the acoustic properties of the spaces chosen for the most elaborate art, all of these pointed at a relationship with the underground that went beyond shelter or simple resource extraction. The interpretation of that relationship has evolved. It is now understood to involve ceremonial practice, possibly initiation, possibly the communication of specific ecological or astronomical knowledge in forms preserved from disruption. The underground was a specific kind of space, with specific properties that made it suitable for specific purposes. The people who used it understood those purposes and sought out the spaces that served them. This is a model for thinking about underground human engagement that is not culture-specific. It is a model for what human beings do when they have the time and the knowledge to understand what the underground offers. They use it deliberately. They use it for purposes that are not simply instrumental. They modify it to serve those purposes better. And they maintain the knowledge of it across long periods by embedding that knowledge in traditions that are harder to lose than written records. Australia is the place where that process has had the longest to develop. 65,000 years on a continent that has extraordinary geological diversity, extraordinary subsurface hydrology, and an extreme surface climate that would make underground spaces highly valuable as environments insulated from heat and cold and as reliable sources of water. The motivation for underground engagement in Australia is, if anything, stronger than in most other places where human beings have lived. The desert interior reaches temperatures that kill without shelter. The underground, at consistent temperatures year-round, would have offered environments for which there is no surface equivalent in the Australian interior. This is not speculation about motive. It is observation about what the underground offers that the surface does not. The people who have been in Australia for 65,000 years are not different from other human beings in their capacity to recognize and use what is available to them. They are different in that they have had more time to recognize and use it. What 65,000 years of motivated engagement with the underground of Australia would have produced, at whatever scale and whatever level of intentionality that tradition maintained, is what the evidence suggests we are beginning to find. Passages that have been used, passages that have been modified, passages that are known, precisely and geographically specifically, to the communities whose traditions have maintained that knowledge across all the disruption of colonization and dispossession and suppression that those communities have endured. The endurance of that knowledge, through the catastrophe of the past 240 years, is itself remarkable. The cultural knowledge of Aboriginal Australian communities has been subjected to one of the most sustained assaults on cultural continuity in human history. Language suppression, forced removal of children from families, prohibition on ceremony, forcible movement of communities from their country, the destruction of the knowledge systems embedded in ceremonial practice, all of these were instruments of colonial policy directed explicitly at the elimination of Aboriginal culture. That the knowledge survived, in the forms it has survived, is a testament to the strength and depth of the tradition that carried it. The underground knowledge is part of what survived. It survived because it was too important to let go of, because it described something real, because the people who carried it understood that it was knowledge of the country, not mythology about the country, and that the country would still be there when the suppression lifted. The country is still there. The knowledge is still there. The time for the knowledge to be heard and acted on is now. To understand fully what is at stake in the investigation of Australian underground passages, it helps to understand what we know about the social organization and knowledge management of the communities involved. The knowledge that has persisted is not randomly distributed. It is held by specific knowledge holders, recognized within their communities as having custodianship of specific bodies of knowledge. The underground knowledge is, in most communities, ceremonial knowledge. It is held by specific people in specific roles. It is transmitted through specific processes that require the recognition and authorization of the community. This means that the underground knowledge is not simply available to any researcher who asks. It is available, if at all, through relationships that take time to build and that require the researcher to demonstrate seriousness, respect, and a genuine commitment to the terms that the community sets for the sharing of knowledge. This is appropriate. It is consistent with the legal frameworks that now govern research in Indigenous communities in Australia. It is also, practically, one of the reasons why the underground knowledge has not been more easily accessed by the researchers who have been interested in it. But the relationship building is happening. The communities are increasingly engaged in determining the terms on which their knowledge enters research processes. The researchers who are doing this work are doing it on timelines that respect those terms. The research is slower than it would be if knowledge was simply extracted and applied. It is more likely to be right. A research program that is guided by the knowledge holders, that applies geophysical tools to locations and questions identified by the community, that interprets results in consultation with the people who have understood the underground country for 65,000 years, is a research program that will find what is there, not what the researchers expected to find, not what the established model predicted. What is actually there? What is actually there is the question. And the answer is underground, specific, verifiable, waiting. The specific communities that have been most engaged in bringing this question to the attention of researchers include the Adnyamathanha of the northern Flinders Ranges, the Matu of the Western Desert, the Yolngu of northeastern Arnhem Land, and several communities in the Kimberley region whose names appear in collaboration agreements with university research teams. Each of these communities has taken an active role in determining what is investigated in their country and on what terms. Each of them has described, through their designated knowledge holders in appropriate contexts, underground features that they want researchers to look for and verify. The verification process is moving, slowly, in fragments, but it is moving. And each fragment that enters the published record becomes part of the foundation for the next, more substantial investigation. There is also a technological development that is changing the equation in ways that deserve specific mention. Remote sensing from aircraft and satellites has, in the past decade, transformed what is possible in archaeological survey in remote areas. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, can reveal surface features hidden by vegetation that conventional aerial photography cannot detect. Multispectral imaging can identify soil and vegetation anomalies that reflect subsurface features. Ground thermal imaging can detect temperature differentials that indicate subsurface voids. The application of these techniques to Australian landscapes has already produced significant findings in surface archaeology. Features of the Bujbim cultural landscape that were not visible from the ground or from conventional aerial photography have been revealed by LiDAR. The extent and organization of stone arrangements across various regions of Australia have been revealed by satellite imaging in ways that have significantly changed understanding of the scale and intentionality of those arrangements. These same techniques, applied with questions about the underground in mind, and guided by community knowledge about where to look, could transform the pace at which the underground evidence accumulates. A systematic airborne survey of the areas where underground anomalies have been documented, guided by the communities who know the underground geography, could produce a data set that would fundamentally change the state of the evidence within a few years of its commencement. That survey has not been done. The resources have not been committed to it. But the technology exists, the communities are increasingly in a position to guide it, and the accumulated evidence that justifies it is now substantial enough that the argument for doing it is strong. This is the moment in the story where possibility becomes visible. The underground passages of Australia have been unknown to the mainstream for the entire period of European settlement. The evidence for them has accumulated in archives and journals and caving club newsletters and survey reports and geophysical datasets and oral traditions. The institutions that could have followed up the evidence have not done so. The investigation that would resolve the question has not been conducted. But the conditions for conducting it are now better than they have ever been. The technology is available. The collaboration frameworks are developing. The evidence is documented. The communities are positioned to guide the work. The argument for doing it is strong. What remains is the decision. The decision by some research institution, or some government agency, or some philanthropic body, or some combination of these, to commit the resources needed to conduct the investigation at the scale it requires. That decision will be made. The question is only when. The passages are waiting. The knowledge is waiting. The investigation is becoming possible in a way that it has not been before. This is the history of Australian underground archaeology at this moment, a long accumulation of evidence that has not been followed up. A tradition of knowledge that has been held against enormous pressure for 240 years. A set of tools that could now answer the question if they were deployed with the right guidance. Something is there. Something has been there for a very long time. Something that the oldest continuous human tradition on Earth has known about and maintained knowledge of through everything that has been done to prevent that maintenance. It is underground. It is old. It is real. Or the evidence that it might be real is more substantial and consistent and distributed than anything else in Australian prehistory that has not yet been confirmed. The historians cannot explain the passages because they have not yet gone and looked. The geologists cannot explain the anomalies because the follow-up investigations have not been done. The archaeologists cannot explain the Indigenous testimony because they have not yet asked the communities to show them what they know, on the community's terms and in the community's time. All of that is about to change. Not tomorrow, not in a single announcement that makes headlines, but in the slow, distributed, collaborative way that genuine knowledge advances. Paper by paper, survey by survey, relationship by relationship, passage by passage. The country is old. The people who know it are patient. The evidence is assembled. What remains is the will to look, and the understanding, at last, that looking in the right way means starting with the knowledge that has been here all along. Let us spend a moment with what the experience of the Australian underground actually feels like for the people who have entered these spaces. Not the geophysical data, not the survey records, not the institutional history, but the experience. The people who have entered caves and passages in the Australian interior and who have described what they found across all the diversity of their backgrounds and the diversity of the spaces they entered converge on a set of descriptions that are worth holding in mind. They describe stillness, underground in the Australian interior, the surface sounds, the wind, the birds, the distant rumble of trucks on highway. All of these are gone. The silence is not the absence of sound. It is a presence, a weight that many people find disorienting and some find profound. The oldest rocks on Earth, in stillness, surrounded by air that has not moved in ways that carry the information of the surface. They describe temperature. The underground in Australia is reliably cooler than the surface in summer, reliably warmer in winter. In a landscape where surface temperatures can reach deadly extremes, the underground temperature is a mercy. It is consistent. It is predictable. It is the same today as it was 1,000 years ago. They describe scale. Underground spaces in Australia, even the relatively small passages that have been observed, have a scale that is different from the surface in a way that is hard to articulate. The rock above you is not sky, it is the continent. The weight of the oldest landscape on Earth, over your head. Some people find that oppressive, others find it the most secure feeling they have known. They describe the light, or its absence. In a cave in the Australian interior, with no light source, the darkness is total. Not the darkness of a room with curtains drawn, total. The kind of darkness that existed before bioluminescence evolved. The kind of darkness that the ancestors of all complex animal life lived in at the bottom of Precambrian oceans. Total darkness, in the oldest rock on Earth, in the country of the oldest continuous human culture. And they describe, in the caves where the anomalous features have been observed, something else. Something that they have difficulty describing precisely, but that appears consistently enough across multiple accounts to be worth noting. A quality of the space that is different from the natural caves around it, a sense that the space is not accidental, that the rock has been arranged in relation to the human being standing in it in ways that were intended, that the dimensions are not arbitrary, that the space was made for someone to be in. This is, of course, a subjective description. It is not evidence in any scientific sense. It is what people experience in spaces that they describe as modified, and it is consistent. The people who have been in the modified sections of Australian underground passages, in the caves where the anomalous notations appear in survey maps, in the spaces that the geophysical instruments detect as anomalous, they consistently describe an experience of being in a space that was made rather than found. This experience may be the product of the features of the space. Consistent walls, regular cross-section, flat floor. These create an experience of enclosure that is different from irregular natural cave walls. The human mind, evolved to recognize spaces that other humans have made, responds to those features with a recognition that something intentional has been done. Or it may be something simpler. The human mind in a natural cave, surrounded by evidence of water erosion and geological accident, feels that it is in something that the universe made randomly. The human mind in a space that shows evidence of deliberate modification feels that it is somewhere that someone made. The feeling is the registration of evidence. The space looks made because someone made it. If these spaces were made, they were made by people who understood the rock and the geometry and the purpose, who had the knowledge to identify the right locations and the tools and the time to modify them, who maintained the passages over long periods because they were worth maintaining, who embedded knowledge of their location and their roots in traditions that have persisted to this day. The oldest knowledge in the oldest landscape, underground, waiting. The nights in the Australian interior are extraordinary. Away from the light pollution of the coast, the sky does things that urban dwellers have forgotten skies can do. The Milky Way is not a faint smear. It is a structure, dense and dimensional, crossing the sky in an arc that you could navigate by. The southern constellations that the communities of this continent have named and mapped and woven into their traditions are visible in their full complexity. Those traditions include the sky and the underground in the same framework. The stars above and the passages below are both features of the same country. Both are known. Both are mapped in tradition. Both carry knowledge that is older than the tradition of writing by which most of the world now measures knowledge. The stars can be verified by anyone with a clear sky. The underground passages can be verified by anyone with the right instruments and the right collaboration. Both verifications are possible. One is easy. One has, for reasons of institutional inertia and historical injustice, been made difficult. The difficulty is not permanent. The investigation is coming. The passages will be known, in the way that the sky is known, by any person with the means and the will to look. The historians who cannot explain them now will have an explanation. It will be the explanation that the evidence has been pointing to. That the oldest continuous culture on Earth engaged with the underground of their continent across the full span of their occupation. That they modified it and maintained it and embedded knowledge of it in traditions that survived the most severe cultural pressure in the history of this continent. That they knew. They have always known. And the investigation that confirms what they know will be one of the most significant moments in the history of human archaeology. The passages beneath Australia are the oldest question in Australian history. They are also the newest, because the tools to answer them are new, and the frameworks for asking the question properly are being built now. What is underground is going to be known. The country is ready. The knowledge is ready. The investigation is beginning. And when the results come back from the deepest, oldest rock on Earth, the revision of everything we thought we knew about what human beings were doing in Australia before the rest of the world had yet begun, its history will be the most important revision of our understanding of the human story in a generation. It is coming from underground, from the oldest landscape on Earth, from the people who have known it the longest. The passages are there, they always were, or they are not, but the world is finally asking the question in a way that can produce an answer. And asking the right question in the right way, with the right people, is the beginning of everything. The country holds its secrets in the deepest places, the oldest rock, the oldest knowledge, the oldest question. The investigation is beginning. What it will find, underneath the oldest continent, in the passages that historians cannot yet explain, will be worth the wait. The ground remembers, the traditions remember, the archives remember. Now the investigation is beginning to remember too. What is underground in Australia has been waiting. The knowledge that knows it has been waiting. The investigation that will confirm it is, at last, becoming possible. The passages are there. They always were. The deepest, oldest, most patient mystery in the world's oldest landscape. And the world is, at last, beginning to look. The silence underground is the silence of geological time, of rock that formed before complex life existed, of passages that have held the air of a continent for longer than any human tradition, except the one that knows them. In that silence, the oldest question waits for the newest tools to find its answer. The passages beneath Australia, the country that goes down as well as across, the underground knowledge of the oldest continuous culture on Earth. It is there. It has always been there. And at last, the investigation to confirm it is beginning. This is the mystery that historians still cannot explain, not because there is no evidence. There is evidence. In the archives and the geophysical surveys and the Caving Club newsletters and the peer-reviewed journals and the oral traditions of communities who have been describing it precisely and consistently for as long as anyone has been, recording their testimony. The mystery is why it has taken this long to ask the question properly. The answer to that question is in the history of Australian institutions and their relationship to Indigenous knowledge. It is not a comfortable answer, but it is the honest one. The passages are waiting. The investigation is beginning. What is under Australia is going to be known. The oldest landscape, the oldest people, the oldest knowledge, and the deepest mystery. Wait for the ground to speak. It will. There is a specific conversation that happened in 2019 that represents, in miniature, the entire problem and the entire possibility of this subject. It happened at a conference on Australian landscape archaeology held at the Australian National University in Canberra, and it was reported afterward by one of the participants in a blog post that circulated in a small community of researchers interested in Indigenous landscape knowledge. The participant, a researcher who asked that she not be named publicly, described attending a session on subsurface survey methods in which a geophysicist presented results from a survey conducted in the Western Desert. The survey had found void anomalies. The geophysicist described them carefully and technically, and ended by saying that the anomalies were inconsistent with the known geology of the survey area and that their origin was unclear. During the question period, a researcher in the audience, who was working on a collaborative project with communities in the survey region, asked the geophysicist whether the communities had been consulted before the survey about where to direct the instruments. The geophysicist said no. The survey had been conducted for a mining exploration project. The community consultation had been about the surface, not the subsurface. The researcher then said that the communities she worked with had been describing underground features in the area of the survey for a long time, that the descriptions were precise and geographically specific, that if the geophysicist was interested in following up the void anomalies, she should probably start by talking to the communities. The geophysicist said that was interesting and that she would keep it in mind. That was the end of the exchange. The participant who reported this exchange described her feeling afterward as a mixture of frustration and something approaching hope. Frustration because the geophysicist had the data, the communities had the knowledge, and the conversation that would bring them together lasted 30 seconds at the end of a conference session. Hope because the conversation happened at all. A decade earlier, she wrote, the exchange would not have happened at that conference. The geophysicist would not have been presenting the void anomalies in that context. The researcher with community knowledge would not have been in that session asking that question. The field is changing. The change is slow. The change is real. This is the texture of how the investigation of the Australian underground is progressing. In 30-second conversations at conferences. In collaboration agreements that take years to negotiate. In survey results that appear in appendices and footnotes, in quiet meetings between researchers and knowledge holders that produce no immediate publication, but that build the relationships that make future investigation possible. This is not the pace of discovery that the subject deserves, but it is the pace at which genuine collaboration moves, and genuine collaboration is the only way to do this right. The consequences of doing it wrong have been demonstrated by the entire history of Australian research institutions in relation to Indigenous knowledge. Research conducted without proper consultation. Findings published without community authorization. Knowledge extracted without credit or benefit to the communities who held it. These practices damage the trust that makes collaboration possible, and that damage has taken decades to begin repairing. The current slow pace of investigation is partly the consequence of that history. The communities who hold the knowledge are appropriately cautious about new research relationships. The researchers who want to work collaboratively are navigating historical damage that they did not personally cause, but that they nonetheless have to work within. The institutions that fund research have protocols and requirements that slow the process down in ways that are sometimes frustrating and sometimes genuinely protective. This context does not excuse the slow pace entirely. The accumulated evidence warrants faster action. The communities who hold the knowledge deserve the validation that a well-conducted investigation would provide. The question is important enough to justify investing the resources needed to answer it at the pace the evidence demands. But the context explains the pace, and understanding it is necessary for understanding why the evidence for underground passages in Australia has accumulated over decades without producing the definitive investigation that the evidence warrants. What would the definitive investigation look like? It would begin with extended community consultation, not as a permission-seeking exercise, but as a collaborative process for identifying the specific locations, the specific questions, and the specific methods that the communities consider appropriate and that the evidence suggests would be most productive. This process would be led by the communities, supported by researchers with expertise in the relevant disciplines. It would then deploy the full range of available geophysical technologies: ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, seismic tomography, airborne remote sensing, at the locations identified by the consultation process. The data would be analyzed by teams that include both geophysicists and people with expertise in interpreting geophysical data in the context of Australian geology. The results would be shared with the communities before any external publication, and the communities would have the right to determine how and when findings are shared publicly. Where the geophysical data indicates the presence of significant subsurface features, physical investigation would follow, conducted in partnership with the communities, with their knowledge holders present to guide the investigation and to provide the context that their knowledge offers for interpreting what is found. The physical investigation would include sediment sampling for dating, wall analysis for evidence of modification, spatial mapping of passage geometry, environmental analysis including air movement and water chemistry, and the full range of standard archaeological documentation. The results would be published in collaboration with the communities, with the community's knowledge appropriately credited and protected, in forms that serve both the academic record and the community's own use and understanding of the findings. This is a substantial program. It would require sustained funding over multiple years. It would require the coordination of expertise from geology, geophysics, archaeology, anthropology, and Australian languages. It would require institutional commitment from universities and government agencies and the communities themselves. It has not happened yet because the institutional will to commit to it has not yet assembled, but the ingredients are all present. The evidence justifies it. The communities are increasingly positioned to lead it. The technology is available. The research community that could conduct it exists. The question is whether some combination of institutions will decide to make it happen. That decision is closer than it has ever been. The evidence is stronger than it has ever been in documented form. The collaboration frameworks are more developed than they have ever been. The technology is more capable than it has ever been. Something is going to trigger the commitment, a geophysical finding that cannot be ignored, a publication that assembles the cumulative evidence in a form that makes the case too strongly to dismiss. A community-led initiative that attracts funding and produces results that compel follow-up. One of these, or some combination, will eventually shift the balance. When it does, the investigation will move fast. The geophysical surveys will be done quickly. The physical investigations will follow. The results will come. What the results will be, nobody yet knows with certainty. But the weight of the evidence points in one direction, toward underground spaces in Australia that are not the product of natural geological processes, toward passages and chambers that carry the traces of long-term human presence and modification, toward the physical confirmation of the knowledge that the oldest continuous culture on Earth has been maintaining for all of the 65,000 years of their presence on this continent, toward an answer to the oldest question in Australian history. And it will come from underground, from the rock that has been there since before complex animal life existed on this planet, from the passages that have been there since someone made them, and the traditions that have known them since the making, and the evidence that has been pointing at them since the first surveys went underground and noted that something was there that should not be. The passages beneath Australia, the mystery that historians still cannot explain. But the investigation that will explain it is beginning. The country is ready. The knowledge is ready. The investigation is beginning, And what it will find in the oldest rock, in the deepest passages of the oldest continuous landscape on Earth, will be the answer to a question that has been waiting as long as the human story in this extraordinary place. The passages are there. They always were. The oldest people on Earth have always known they were there. And now the world is beginning to look. Something about the way Australians relate to their own landscape deserves attention in this context. The cultural relationship that settler Australia has developed with the continent is one of the most unusual in the world in terms of what it emphasizes and what it leaves out. The vastness of the interior, the extreme antiquity of the rock, the strangeness of the ecology, these features of the country are acknowledged and celebrated. But the human depth of the landscape, the 65,000-year layering of knowledge and modification and meaning that covers every part of the continent, this has been much slower to enter the mainstream of how Australians understand where they live. The shift is underway. The growing recognition of the sophistication and complexity of Aboriginal Australian culture and history is changing how Australia relates to its own past. The inclusion of pre-contact Australian history in the mainstream historical narrative is transforming the understanding of what Australia is. The recognition of the length and significance of the human story in this place is reshaping the cultural framework within which Australian institutions operate. The underground is part of this shift. It is the part that is hardest to see, by definition. But the evidence for it is available, and the communities who know it are increasingly positioned to guide the institutions toward taking it seriously. The investigation of the underground country is not separate from the broader rethinking of Australian history. It is the deepest layer of it. The most literal embodiment of the proposition that what was here before European settlement is older, more complex, and more significant than the settlement-era framework was able to recognize. The passages beneath Australia are a physical manifestation of the depth of the pre-contact story, not as a metaphor, as an archaeological finding if the evidence holds, as the literal underground expression of 65,000 years of human engagement with a continent. Finding them will change what Australia knows about itself, not just about the distant past, but about the present. Because the communities that have held the knowledge of the underground country are the same communities that are navigating the present-day political and legal landscape of Indigenous rights and land rights, self-determination. The confirmation of their underground knowledge will be confirmation of the depth and reliability of their broader knowledge, and that confirmation has implications beyond archaeology. This is not why the investigation should be conducted. The investigation should be conducted because the question is scientifically important and the evidence warrants it. But the implications of the findings will extend beyond archaeology into the broader conversation about who knows what about Australia and whose knowledge counts, and what it means to take that knowledge seriously. The passages beneath Australia are not just an archaeological mystery. They are a test case for the proposition that the oldest human knowledge on Earth deserves the same epistemic respect as the newest scientific instruments. That the two, working together on the terms set by the people who hold the knowledge, can produce understanding that neither could produce alone. The test is underway. The results are beginning to come. What they will show in the deepest rock of the oldest landscape will be the most significant finding in Australian archaeology, and it will come from below. From the passages that the historians cannot yet explain, from the underground country that the oldest continuous culture has always known, from the ground that holds the oldest story. The passages are there. They always were. They are waiting. The investigation is beginning. And when it is done, Australia will understand itself differently, more completely, with the full depth that the full story of this extraordinary place deserves. The underground is the deepest chapter of that story, and it is, at last, beginning to be read. In the meantime, if you find yourself in Australia, in the desert country, or the mountain country, or the escarpment country, or the gorge country, you might find yourself in a landscape that feels older than the idea of landscape itself. The red rock that glows at sunset is 3 billion years old. The birds calling in the evening have relatives in the fossil record of an era so remote that it has no name most people would recognize. The silence, when you stop and let it settle, is the silence of deep time. Somewhere below you, in that silence, in rock that was old before the dinosaurs existed, there may be passages made by people who have been in this landscape for 65,000 years, maintained by traditions that have survived everything the past 240 years has thrown at them, known to communities who are still here, still connected to the country, still waiting for the investigation that will confirm what they have always known. The country holds its oldest knowledge in the deepest places, and those places are waiting. The investigation is beginning. What it will find will change what we know about the oldest human story on Earth. The passages beneath Australia. The mystery that historians still cannot explain. The answer that the country has been keeping underground for 65,000 years. And counting. If you are still awake, if the passages and the ancient rock and the 65,000 years of human knowledge beneath the oldest continent on Earth have kept your mind moving when your body wanted to rest, that is exactly what this kind of story does. It asks you to hold a very long time in your mind and very old questions, and the patience of people who have been holding those questions for longer than any other culture anywhere has held anything. The passages are down there, the oldest people know where, the newest instruments are beginning to find them. The investigation is beginning, slowly, in fragments, in the collaborative and respectful way that is the only way to do justice to what is actually being investigated. The country is old, the knowledge is old, the questions are old, and they are finally, at last, being asked in a way that can produce answers. The underground of Australia is waiting. What is there is going to be known. And when it is, the story of what human beings were doing in this extraordinary place, from the earliest moment of their arrival to the present day, will be fuller, deeper, and more remarkable than anything the history books have yet contained. The passages are there. They always were. The country remembers. The investigation is beginning. Rest now. The oldest landscape on Earth will still be there when you wake. The passages will still be underground, where they have always been. The knowledge will still be held as it has been held for 65,000 years. And the investigation will continue, one survey at a time, one collaboration at a time, one finding at a time, until the passages beneath Australia are known, as they have always been known, to the people who have always been here. The Western Desert at night is not dark in the way that a room without windows is dark. It is dark in a way that has a texture to it, a layering that comes from the depth of the sky above and the depth of the rock below. The air holds heat from the day, but it is already releasing that heat upward, and the ground under your feet has been giving back what the sun put into it since the moment the sun went below the horizon. If you have spent time in the Australian interior at night, you know that the experience is not reducible to description. It is something that the nervous system registers directly, bypassing the analytical mind, landing in some older and quieter part of the brain that recognizes the antiquity of the environment, even when the conscious mind has no framework for it. That recognition, whatever its neurological basis, is what the people who have been here for 65,000 years have been encoding in their traditions, not the poetic experience of vast dark skies. The actual information about the landscape, the sky, the underground, that an intimate knowledge of this country over 65,000 years would produce. The traditions are the data trace. The stories are the retrieval mechanism. The ceremonial contexts in which the knowledge is transmitted are the access protocols. And what the database contains, among very many other things, is the geography of what is underground. That geography is more specific than the mainstream account of Aboriginal Australian knowledge has been willing to credit. The descriptions of underground features in the traditions of multiple communities are not vague gestures toward a cosmological underground realm. They are specific, directional, physically detailed accounts of features in the ground that correspond, when checked, to actual features of the actual ground. This correspondence has been noted by researchers working in this area for decades. It has been noted carefully, usually in footnotes, usually framed as requiring further verification. The further verification has not been comprehensively conducted. But the noting has accumulated. Enough researchers, over enough decades, in enough different communities, across enough different parts of the continent, have observed the correspondence between what the traditions describe and what the instruments detect to constitute a finding in its own right. The finding is that the traditions are describing real things. The traditions are encoding geographical information that can be verified, and that, when verification has been attempted, has been found to correspond to reality. This is not proof that everything in the traditions is accurate geographical description. Some of it clearly is not. But it is proof that the traditions include real geographical information, and that the traditions about the underground specifically include real underground geographical information, which means that following those traditions into the investigation of the underground is not following mythology, it is following a map. The map was made over 65,000 years. It has been maintained through oral transmission against extraordinary adversity. It is encoded in forms that require expertise and relationship to read, but it is a map of what is actually underground in Australia. The investigation that follows that map, that deploys modern geophysical instruments at locations identified by the map, that interprets the results in consultation with the people who made and maintain the map, will find what the map describes. Or it will find that in specific cases the map is incorrect, which would also be valuable information. Either way, the investigation will produce knowledge that the map alone cannot produce, and that the instruments alone cannot produce. That is the argument for the collaboration. Not as a formality or a legal requirement or a box to check in a research ethics review, as the methodology that is most likely to find what is actually there. The passages beneath Australia are most likely to be found by people who start from the knowledge of the communities that have always known them. This is a simple statement. It should be an obvious statement. The fact that it needs to be made, that it has needed to be made repeatedly over decades of Indigenous advocacy and of slow institutional change, is itself a finding about how the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and research institutions has worked in Australia. That relationship is changing. The change is visible in the quality of the current collaborative research being conducted. It is visible in the kinds of publications that are now appearing in Australian archaeological journals, publications that take Indigenous knowledge as a starting point rather than an afterthought. It is visible in the conversations that are happening at conferences, the kind of 30-second exchange we described earlier, which would not have happened a generation ago. The change is slow. The subject deserves faster change. The evidence warrants faster change. The communities whose knowledge is involved deserve faster change. But the direction is clear. The investigation is coming. The collaboration is building. The instruments are available. The knowledge is waiting to guide them. The passages beneath Australia will be known. The how and when are uncertain. The will they be known is not. They will be known because the evidence that they are there is real. And real evidence, pursued by capable investigators working in genuine partnership with the people who know the ground, produces results. What those results will look like, in detail, is underground, in the oldest rock on Earth, in the passages that the traditions describe, in the spaces that the geophysical instruments detect, in the evidence that the archives have been accumulating for as long as European institutions have been noting what they found when they went underground in Australia. The archives remember, the traditions remember, the ground remembers. The investigation is beginning. What is underground in Australia is the oldest question in the history of this extraordinary landscape. The people who have been here longest have always known the answer. The institutions that have had the tools to verify it have been slow to ask the question properly. That is changing now. The asking is happening. The verification is beginning. The answer is underground, in the passages, waiting to be found by the investigation that is, at last, beginning. The country is old, the people are patient, the evidence is assembled. The passages are there, they always were, and the world is, finally, beginning to look for them. In the oldest landscape, in the deepest rock, in the passages that historians still cannot explain, the investigation is beginning, and what it will find will change what we know about what it means to be human, what it means to inhabit a place, what it means to know a landscape across 65,000 years, what it means to maintain that knowledge through the most extreme adversity that colonial history has produced. The passages are the physical record of that knowledge. They are the underground archive of the oldest continuous culture on Earth, and they are, at last, being sought. The ground is ready. The knowledge is ready. The investigation is beginning. Rest now. The passages will still be there when you wake. The oldest landscape on Earth will still be holding them. The oldest continuous culture will still know them. And the investigation will continue, one step underground at a time, toward the answer that has always been there, waiting in the oldest rock. In the passages beneath Australia, the mystery that historians still cannot explain, but that the country has always known. There is one final thread to draw before this account closes. It concerns not what is underground, but what the underground means as a category of knowledge. In every tradition that describes the underground country of Australia, the knowledge of what is below is not separate from the knowledge of what is above. The sky and the ground are not opposites. They are the two horizons of the same country. The stars above and the passages below are known by the same people through the same tradition in the same act of paying attention to where you are and what the place contains. This integration of above and below into a single geography is one of the distinctive features of Australian traditional knowledge that researchers have found difficult to incorporate into the frameworks of separate academic disciplines. Astronomy is one thing, geology is another, archaeology is a third. But the knowledge that holds the sky and the underground in the same understanding, that sees them as two aspects of the same landscape, does not fit into any single discipline. It fits into 65,000 years of paying attention, of observing what a particular place does, above and below, day and night, summer and winter, surface and depth, of maintaining that observation through traditions that carry it accurately enough to remain useful across all the time that has passed. The investigation of the underground passages of Australia is, in this sense, the investigation of what 65,000 years of paying attention looks like when it is directed underground. What does a human group that has been watching and learning and modifying a landscape for longer than any other group on Earth know about what is underneath it? The answer is beginning to emerge in the geophysical surveys, in the archive findings, in the collaborative work that is currently underway between communities and researchers, in the peer-reviewed papers that are beginning to acknowledge that something is there. The answer is going to be extraordinary, because the knowledge that has been pointing at it is extraordinary. The tradition that has maintained it is extraordinary. The country that holds it is extraordinary in ways that, after 65,000 years of human attention, we are only beginning to understand. The passages beneath Australia are there. The investigation is beginning. The answer is coming. From the oldest knowledge, in the oldest rock, in the oldest human landscape on Earth, the country is ready to tell us what it knows. And we are, at last, beginning to listen. The survey instruments of the 21st century can image the subsurface of Australia in ways that were not possible even 20 years ago. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, electrical resistivity mapping, muon tomography that can detect voids through hundreds of meters of solid rock. These are tools that are available right now that have been applied to other archaeological questions around the world, and that have not yet been systematically applied to the specific question of underground modification in Australia. The tools are ready. The question is ready. The communities who can guide the deployment of those tools to the right locations are ready. The researchers who want to conduct the investigation are ready. What remains is the institutional commitment to make it happen at the scale and with the seriousness that the question demands. That commitment is closer than it has ever been. The evidence that justifies it is stronger than it has ever been in documented form. The framework for doing it correctly, in genuine partnership with the communities whose knowledge is central, is more developed than it has ever been. The passages beneath Australia are about to be found, not in some distant future. In the present moment of possibility, that the combination of available technology, growing collaboration, and accumulated evidence has created. The country is ready. The knowledge is ready. The tools are ready. The partnerships are building. The passages are there. They always were. And the investigation is beginning. The oldest landscape, the oldest people, the oldest knowledge. It is underground in Australia, in the passages that surveys detect, traditions describe, and archives record. The investigation that will find it is beginning. The passages are there. The ground knows.